I wouldn't have believed he was cheating if it wasn't for the pictures. I've been cheated on before, and I think the number one tell is that cheaters like to spread the guilt around. They make mountains of every little molehill because they want to feel like the relationship was doomed, and that's why they cheated, not the other way around. They find all sorts of silly reasons to fight you because it's better to tell people, "Oh, we were arguing and communication broke down," instead of the truth, which is often, "I screwed a stranger." That's my experience of being cheated on anyway. I had one boyfriend who lost his mind because I didn't answer my phone while on a night out. What would have been a small deal just a few weeks before was suddenly proof that I was sneaking around and couldn't be trusted. Sure enough, just a few days later, I caught him at a Starbucks with some girl he'd met online. Do you think he told his parents I left him because he had his hands up another woman's skirt? Nope. He said we'd been distant for a while and arguing lots, and in a moment of weakness, he found solace in another woman. He just left out the part where he initiated all those arguments. But my husband never changed. Not one bit. Didn't kiss me different, didn't look at me different, didn't change his habits. Not in any way at all. Wasn't like he started randomly showering when he got home, or going to the gym at night instead of in the morning. My mother said she knew my father had started seeing someone else when she went to take his plate away and there was food left behind, and soon after she caught him looking in the mirror and sucking in his gut. I guess my point is, a lot of the time when you realize you've been cheated on, you look back and see all sorts of little clues. But I never felt that way with my husband. It was just out of the blue. The envelope arrived, thick as a pack of cards, red lipstick on the back reading, "You need to see what your man is up to." Inside were half a dozen Polaroids of my husband sleeping with another woman. Her face was obscured, but his. He had a strange look about him. Blank eyes, a strange expression, but it was so clearly him. I remember feeling so shocked that everything took on a hint of the surreal. Sounds stupid, but for the first few seconds I stared at the photos, dumbfounded, and just thought, good God, where does he find the time? Dumb. Here I was facing proof of the ultimate betrayal, and I was trying to figure out the logistics. It was a good point though, in a weird kind of way. He worked 9 hours a day, and only 2 days a week in the office, and that was a 90-minute commute. His morning routine was to wake up at 6 a.m, go for a run, cook breakfast, shower, shave, do the crossword, drive to work. I mean, really. There wasn't a lot of time where I thought he could even meet another woman, let alone build a whole new relationship. I didn't say anything when he got home. If he was such a good actor, I wanted to be one too. At least in the short term. I wanted control of the situation, and most importantly, I wanted control of myself. Didn't want to burst into tears the second I challenged him. Still, I barely slept that night. I stayed up going through the mechanisms of it all. Was she an escort? I thought that might explain the time constraints. A man could get one of those off the internet, real easy. He wouldn't have to wine and dine anyone then. What would he need, really? Some cash and half an hour somewhere private? And let's be honest with ourselves, men and women both. Half hour is a bit of an overestimate. For most guys I've been with, it's closer to a commercial break. I studied the pictures very closely, looking for answers to these weird questions. From the looks of it, they were going at it in someone's living room. I figured he might have found a prostitute with her own place nearby, although I wasn't necessarily married to that idea. Really, my theory was that whoever he found, they had to be pretty comfortable with no romance. In and out, you know. He was only out of the house 2 days a week. And I knew he really did go to the office because he was once late due to traffic and his boss called up furious and I had to offer up all sorts of excuses. Still, just to be sure, I started testing him in the following days. I'd call his desk phone at random and he was always there. I even called up the receptionist and I said I wanted to send him some flowers for our anniversary. So was there a specific time I should avoid having the delivery guy turn up? And she said no. He was pretty much always at his desk, except for maybe 20 minutes at lunch. That meant whoever he was carrying on with, they had to be meeting up at lunch and doing it all in record time. Which was pretty odd if you ask me. I mean, I had hard proof in my hands, so I couldn't doubt it. But yeah, it was odd to think of him sprinting out to some random woman's house. If this was an affair, how did it start? What were the terms? What did they both get out of it? I mean, it wasn't like he had stopped showing affection to me. Don't get me wrong, after the first picture, I immediately withdrew all intimacy. But what I'm saying is, in the run-up to me finding out, it wasn't like we stopped doing it or even reduced the amount. I suppose he'd always had a bit of a high drive. We both had. I just found it strange. Whatever this affair was, it pretty much had to be only sleeping with each other and nothing else. But at the same time, why not just get a little more from me? In the scheme of things, he was ruining our marriage for 25% more? That struck me as weird too. In my head, I kept going over the whole scenario again and again. If it was just more he wanted, why not just have it with me? I did this when my dad left, by the way, tried to rationalize it, made it into a kind of mystery that had to be solved. Why weren't we enough? Was it because he wanted a son, or because my mother and I were too close and had nothing in common with him? The other woman he left us for wasn't some young bimbo either. She was my mother's age. So what was different about her? What did this woman give him that his home life couldn't? I remember I saw her in the car once, sitting there while he came to the door to see me for an hour or two, while Mum went around back because she couldn't stand the sight of him. And I'd expected some done-up blonde bimbo. But no. Just another middle-aged woman who even looked a bit like my mom did. They say history repeats itself. The woman in those Polaroids looked like me too. Hardly some young model. I couldn't see her face. There was always something blocking it. But she had long brown hair, similar build, similar age. Sounds weird, but I think it would have hurt less if he'd been screwing some blonde in a cheerleader outfit. As it was, every time I looked at those photos, I couldn't escape the feeling that something very specific must be wrong with me, and it couldn't be some shallow physical thing. It was deeper than that, something he realized only after spending 10 years with me. Did I annoy him on a personal level? Did he just look at me one day while I shaved my legs and think gross, and that was that? He got the ick. He didn't get an upgrade, just a replacement, and somehow it just... I don't know. It felt worse. I considered revenge, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. So weird. I put up an Instagram picture that wasn't like the usual ones. Geez, men online don't need a lot to get going, do they? You go to adult sites and see the things women do there, and you figure men must really need some messed up stuff to get turned on. But it turns out there's always some guy waiting to slide into your DMs because you wore mom jeans or ankle socks. All it took for me was a picture in an oversized t-shirt with my legs tucked underneath. You hardly saw any skin. I've seen more revealing adverts. Didn't stop the messages coming in from total strangers and more than a few good friends and old flames. I responded to none of them. Not a single one. They were flattering, but I didn't once feel the urge to reach out. It's just... well, it reminded me of the fact I wasn't starved for attention in the first place. I wasn't unhappy with my relationship. The Polaroids told me I wasn't enough, but I never once felt like it. A part of me wanted to bulldoze over this obstacle in our relationship, fill in the pothole, lay new tarmac, and just keep on using the road like nothing had changed. But I didn't have it in me. Very little time had passed, and I already felt like I was going mad, like I needed to know why the hell he'd done this. Every day was spent oscillating between gut-churning sadness and red-hot fury at the betrayal. Couldn't keep the act up forever. Sooner or later, I'd break. The performance wasn't perfect. He'd noticed the distance between us, kept asking if I was okay. Sooner or later, the answer was going to be a swift kick to the balls. Hadn't the whole point of biding my time been to get a handle of myself, to not lose control and give him the upper hand? That had been moot if I ended up charged with assault. In the end, I decided on a simpler solution. I was going to speak to this other woman. Maybe not head on. My life isn't Jerry Springer. Wasn't going to kick the door down and scream, "You took my man." But maybe I could just bump into her. Just have a chat like, "Oh, hey, nice shoes. Where'd you get them? What kind of work are you in? Do you have some kind of nimble super technique to end marriages?" I joke. It's what I do when I feel uncomfortable. And I felt very uncomfortable at the thought of finding this woman and talking to her. I'm no spy. Talking to strangers makes me anxious enough, let alone when the whole encounter is a ruse because of some Hitchcockian affair. Good news was, I didn't have to look far. One of the Polaroids had a house number and a few buildings in the background that I recognized. Took maybe 20 minutes on Google Maps to pin it down. Nothing difficult. I soon had an address, and it wasn't long before my husband had an in-office day, and I could go investigate. First thing I thought upon seeing the house. Her house looked like a crack den. One of the windows on the top floor had been broken and boarded up. The door was wide open in the middle of the day. The garden was an absolute mess of overgrown weeds and random crap that looked like passers-by had tossed over the wall, but the owners had never cleaned up. It was just all very grey and dingy. It really did look like the kind of place drug dealers would squat. I even checked the telephone poles for a pair of shoes hanging off the wires. I felt pretty sketchy waiting in my car, but it seemed to beat getting out for a walk. I kept thinking I was going to see her come or go, but it just never happened. All I managed was to waste a few hours. I did take some time to compare the Polaroids to the living room window, and it was definitely the same room. Unfortunately, staring at those pictures riled me up. There she was on the sofa, bent over, hair hanging over her face. And there he was behind her. And here I was, in my car, meekly staring at the exact spot I'd been betrayed. It wound me up so bad that I got out of the car and felt a little closer to that Jerry Springer moment I always told myself I'd never have. I think all the weeks of stress and wondering had started to wear me a bit thin, because I was already teary-eyed before I'd passed the garden gate. And my husband, who'd gotten home by now, was texting me, wondering where I was, and I kept ignoring him. Time was passing too quickly when I just wanted it to stand still for a little longer. It felt like now or never. This was the breaking point. I had to know. If she was in there, or if there was some proof he'd been in there, I had to know. I knocked, but got no answer. Since the door was open, I leaned around and had a little peek inside, but ended up nudging it with my elbow and pushed it open even further. The hinges let out a terrible screech, like they'd been standing still for weeks or even months. If someone was in there, they should have come running at the sound. But nothing. Once I was sure I was alone, I stepped inside and revised my earlier opinion. It wasn't a crack den. It was more like a crime scene. Everything was, well, sort of clean, not destitute. There were one or two paintings on the wall, but the glass was so covered in dust I couldn't see anything of the actual images, and the carpet looked filthy, but not gross, just abandoned and left to fester. There weren't cigarette butts everywhere and needles strewn over the place. It was like a normal house that had just been left behind. The main thing I could smell was mold and damp, probably because rain had gotten in through the open door. Not really able to help myself, I went deeper into the house. I looked in the living room, the very same one in those photos, and saw the same thing I had before. A relatively neat room with a sofa and a TV that was covered in dust. Some of it had been disturbed in places, but not enough to suggest regular use. In the Polaroids, it had looked normal, but in person, it was clear to me it hadn't been lived in for years. Jeez, I wondered, did they actually find an abandoned house to use? It was the only thing that made sense to me. Maybe the woman knew about it because she passed it on the way to work or something. But still, I had to wonder how a house could stay empty long enough for mold to settle in, and not for kids or junkies to move in too. There was no graffiti. Some litter outside, I mentioned that, but no used condoms or broken bottles or anything like that. The kitchen was more of the same, so I went upstairs and soon had my suspicions confirmed. First bedroom on the right. Yellow police tape all over the doorframe, although it had since been torn down. Now it just hung there like old streamers from a party that had gone wrong. My God, I realized, it actually is a crime scene. Obviously, I looked inside. I think up until then, I'd fixated a little too much on my social anxiety. I kept expecting to bump into this woman and have some awkward conversation, either about her screwing my husband or me breaking into her home. But leaning into that room made me feel genuine fear. It was the sight of blood. Even old, dried brown blood soaked into an ancient bedspread. I'd never seen anything like it, not in that quantity, and not strewn around so violently. The bed itself had been massacred. Gore-soaked foam and feathers had caked all around the stab marks in the mattress, and there was blood all up the walls and ceiling. Looking at it gave me an immediate sense of what had happened. Someone had laid there, and another person had gone at them with a big knife, maybe kneeling over them. Just bang, 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 one vicious downward thrust after another. I can't really put into words just how vivid it felt. One of those scenes your brains can't help but put back together. Now, who the hell would want to sleep with someone in a house where that happened? Whoever this woman was, I decided she was a freak. I decided any confrontation I was going to have about this affair could be between my husband and me in the safety of my own home where I could lock all the doors. I turned and left, hurried down the stairs, but only got halfway when I heard something strange coming from behind. A giggle that cut through the ambient sounds of my quiet footsteps and the distant traffic. Something about it made me freeze on the spot. It wasn't the laugh of a sane person. I already figured that if this woman lived here, she must have a screw loose. But hearing a chuckle behind me like that made my skin crawl. A part of me wanted to avoid turning around, partly because it felt like I'd be coming face to face with a woman who destroyed my marriage, but also because I was starting to feel genuinely afraid. What the hell was this place? And who the hell would live here in these conditions? I don't know what got me to turn around in the end. Courage, maybe? Or just the desire to get it over with, more likely. When I finally turned, I saw a skinny woman standing on the top of the stairs, hair draped over her face. She certainly resembled the woman in the photos. Then again, what had I really seen of her face? Hair? And that's largely what I could see of the woman in front of me. Hair, wet and greasy, dripping down over her face to cover just about everything except a blood-red grin and a dirt-smeared neck. Beneath that was a body right out of Oliver Twist. Thin and scraggly, clothes hanging loose, bare feet poking out over the top step. It's weird, but it was her toes that made me feel so uneasy. I don't like feet, and hers were like something straight out of The Hobbit. Like she'd spent her whole life living in a ditch off the motorway and eating roadkill. We must have looked at each other for a whole minute before I worked up the courage to do something. She certainly didn't seem bothered at all with the silence. I half suspected she would have stayed there all night, looking at me atop the stairs. Excuse me," she squealed in a girlish imitation. Her voice, like nails on a chalkboard, had an almost physical presence to it that pushed me down one step. Without missing a beat, moving after me like a mirrored reflection, she followed down the stairs one step also. I didn't realize," she crooned while tilting her head left and right. The impression I got right there was of a crow imitating speech. "I'll just..." She grinned, and I got a glimpse of blooded teeth. I could feel it, the tension, the palpable capacity for violence that lurked in the air. She oozed it out of every cell in her body, the promise of a thumbtack in a mouthful of blood. Any second now, I told myself, and she's gonna leap down onto me and bang, 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 bang. One vicious downward thrust after another, just like that bed. Her hands were behind her back, and I had no doubt they were clutching something sharp. "Screw this," I cried and turned, making for the door. It wasn't far, maybe 5 meters at most, but every single step felt like an eternity as I kept waiting to feel something at my back. The blade slicing between my shoulder blades, a hand latching onto my jacket and dragging me backwards, the shove of a body leaping up onto my back, slimy hands reaching out to slit my throat while the weight forced me to my knees. But I made it to the door free and clear and ran straight to my car. I didn't stop until I'd gotten in and locked all the doors. Even then, I only risked one brief glance up at the doorway and saw that it was empty before I turned the ignition and slammed my foot down on the gas. I was crying as I stumbled through the front door, unsure of what had happened, but terrified all the same. I wanted to know that I wasn't alone and cried out, but the house was quiet and empty. Lights off, no TV, no husband. I went looking and found only a letter waiting for me on the kitchen island. Nothing elaborate. Certainly not the confession I initially expected upon seeing it. It was simple, scrawled on a piece of A4 torn out of the Home Office printer. He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. I need a few days to process this. Please don't look for me. We can talk when I come home. Next to the letter was a bundle of Polaroids and an opened envelope. "You need to see what your wife is up to," had been written on the back, and it was nearly identical to the one I'd received weeks ago. The photos were much the same too, only this time the man's face was obscured and the woman's clearly visible. She looked exactly like me. Not a matter of sisters, but twins. A doppelganger even, although something behind the eyes felt out of place. This was my own face, after a night of meth or heroin maybe, and yet still unmistakably mine. Of course, she was familiar for another reason too. There was no mistaking that eerie grin and greasy hair. I'd met her that afternoon. I'd seen her standing at the top of the stairs, crowing my words back at me like some puppet. I couldn't begin to fathom what sick game was being played. I just knew that I had to get in contact with my husband. I tried his number, but it was hardly a surprise when he didn't pick up. I tried again and again and again until, well, it must have been the 15th try when he finally responded. He didn't answer my calls directly. I wasn't lucky. But he did send a voice note. Looking back, it seems so obvious. I assume this started a few weeks ago, yeah? That's when you withdrew. At first I thought maybe I'd done something wrong, but as the days wore on, it became clear to me that something deeper is at play. Never in a million years did I expect this, though. I mean, maybe... I don't know. There were times I thought maybe you were pregnant, afraid after what happened last time. Geez, I thought it could have been anything, but not this. I need time, a day at least, before I even speak to you. This is the last you'll hear of me until I unblock you. Please don't keep reaching out to me. I don't know if you want forgiveness or just to blame me or try and lie your way out of it. But before any of that can happen, I need a day to gather myself. I'll speak to you when I want to speak to you. Not before then. I was so frustrated with this, I whipped my phone at the wall and began to cry, mewing the word stupid at myself over and over again as I realized just how badly I'd been played. In hindsight, it was so obvious I could claw off my own skin with anger. Yes, I'd pulled away. Yes, my behavior had changed. Yes, I'd become irritable and prone to arguing over the silliest little things. This whole thing had been a setup from the start by that crazy woman, and I'd walked right into it. Who's to say that was even my husband in those photos? I mean, if I had a look-alike, why not him? If I just confronted him on day one, maybe we could have made sense of it. But as it was, I looked guilty as sin from where he was standing. Geez, I'd even lied to him about taking time off work. My behavior was practically the poster child for a cheating spouse. I don't know what was being planned here, but I knew something was deeply, profoundly wrong with it all. What the hell was the endgame for these sick freaks? To ruin my marriage? What the hell am I going to do now? I whispered in despair. What the hell am I going to do now? The words were so gentle, I wondered for a moment if they had come from my own mouth. An echo, maybe even my own thoughts mistaken for actual words. But none of that was right, and I knew it. The words had presence in the world. More than that, They had a location. Behind me. Slowly, desperately hoping that I shouldn't have to trust my own senses, I turned to face the hallway I'd just come from. Empty. And yet, why did I get the feeling it had been occupied only a few seconds ago? Some sixth sense, perhaps? The knowledge that just because something looks safe doesn't mean it is. Something had just ducked back out of sight as I turned. I was sure of it. But where? Our cozy little home suddenly seemed far too big for comfort. A doorway here, a stairway there. No lights, aside from what I turned on in the kitchen when I'd rushed in. Was this really the place where my husband had held my hand every time we waited for the doctor to call? Or where we sat and cuddled as I read and he played games? It was wrong. All wrong. "Hello?" I cried out, desperately hoping that reality might suddenly snap back into place. But there was nothing. No echo. Just me. But could I trust that I was alone? My gut said no. There it was again. That itch between my shoulder blades. The same crawling terror I'd felt in that house, knowing that woman might jump at me at any moment from a place atop the stairs. I tried to tell myself the paranoid thoughts should be ignored, but I still reached for a nearby knife and cried out once more, if only to break the silence that felt painfully heavy. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Quietly, I went out into the hallway and switched on the lights. They helped a little, but not enough. From upstairs, a quiet thump. The muffled sound of something moving. I wanted to leave, but go where and to what end? I told myself it could only really be her, couldn't it? And she was, after all, just a person. A thinner, scragglier looking version of myself. I may have spent the last few weeks getting led around by the nose, but I wasn't some docile pet. I was a person. I had agency, and I didn't want to be afraid anymore. Not in my own home. I gripped the knife harder, watched the light glint off its edge, then turned to face the stairs. I was frozen in time, unable to move towards the sound, but unwilling to just leave it all behind. Finally, I worked up the courage to speak, to force out a few shaky and uncertain words. "I know you're up there." No response. At least not verbal. The seconds ticked on, and slowly, almost as if she was relishing it, 4 corpse-pale fingers curled themselves around the top step. I tried to picture the scene at large. The fact that for the last few minutes, me at the bottom of the stairs, her at the top, she had been lying with her whole body pressed flush to the floor, like some kind of spider. Waiting. Just waiting. The thought made me feel sick, like this was far worse than a simple home invasion. And then came her face. My face. And I felt like this was just the beginning of some kind of waking nightmare. It came peering out over the top, a grin as wide as my whole head, with the head cocked to one side like a disappointed puppy. She stared at me with this distorted expression, and then, in one fluid motion, she lifted the rest of her body into sight. "What the hell are you?" she hissed back. Her mouth didn't move an inch. Something behind that horrible smile, something dark, wet and glistening seemed to vibrate. I felt lightheaded as I processed this, felt my nerves turn to water. My hand involuntarily loosen and the knife clatter to the floor. I ran. I'm not sure there was any conscious thought behind it, any decision, rational or otherwise. The same heady punch of terror that propelled me is the same force that made me pee myself when I heard her feet scurrying after me, the same that made me cry out like a damned child as she bore to the floor. It was only the pain of smashing my face into the cold tile that brought me out of the hysterical fear. Looking back, I think it's what saved my life. A bright red splash of blood, a single tooth sent scattering across the floor, my tongue probing the empty space of a missing incisor. The pain caused a kind of knee-jerk reaction, and I kicked back as hard as I could. I made some contact. Not much, but it was enough to let me claw my way back onto my feet and run towards the door. History repeated itself, it seemed. Her behind me as I raced towards the nearest exit. But this time, it was different. This time, she didn't let me get away unharmed. This time, she drove a kitchen knife into the meat of my calf, and it hurt like nothing else I'd ever felt. It sent me toppling over as I screamed in pain, turned my leg to jelly. A bit of luck meant that I managed to reach out and grab the door handle to stop myself going down all the way, but it took every ounce of willpower I had to hold myself there as I vented the pain in a gut-wrenching cry. With one hand, I tried to stem the bleeding in my leg, while with the other I fumbled around to open the door. It took a good few seconds, longer than I wanted it to, long enough for me to glance over and see her standing there, breathing so heavily her whole body shook. She might have been laughing, or maybe this was her imitating my cries of pain. I couldn't be sure. But I found myself hoping that I was going to wake up any second now, that this was a nightmare, a gross perversion of my imagination cranked up to 11. But time just kept going, one hand desperately trying to work the key in the lock, the other clutching a lump of muscle that throbbed in pain, my skin slick with hot blood, wet socks, slippery floor. Am I going to pass out, I wondered. What is she going to do to me if I do? She took a step towards me, savouring my weakness. I sobbed and kicked out with my one good leg, but this sad gesture meant I lost my footing and slid down to the floor where I sat, back against the door, and watched helplessly as she stalked closer. "What do you want?" I sobbed. "What do you want?" she chirped back at me from her frozen mouth. God, whatever was moving behind those awful teeth, it looked almost insectile. The last thing I remember before the pain became too much was her face, closer than it should be, and all lit up impossibly bright by a swirling cascade of blues and reds. That face of hers, my face, it was haunting. Bloodshot eyes that darted over my features like a predator savouring its kill. And that mouth, and the chitinous thing that swirled within, slowly opening wider and wider. I awoke, screaming. Several orderlies, big men, pinning me down as panicked nurses and doctors worked away at my leg. One of them told me I was safe, but it took an age for the words to sink in. It was only when I remembered the lights that I began to calm. Red and blue. A neighbour had called the police in response to all the noise. When the nurses explained what had happened, I cried with relief. Who would have thought I'd be so thankful for nosy neighbours? They figured it might have been a domestic situation gone wrong, but when the cops turned up and found me bleeding all over the floor with a 6-inch carving knife jutting out of my leg, They knew it was much, much worse. A home invasion, they told me. I wanted to correct them. I stammered out a kind of fumbled response about a woman in my home, and they nodded. But how could I explain to them the madness of the last few weeks? When they told me about my missing clothes and jewelry, about the way someone had clearly ransacked the home for valuables, it was clear as day they made up their mind about it being a burglary gone wrong. The thought of her rummaging through my things disgusted me. The notion that she had gone rifling through my things. Of course, my clothes and jewelry were missing. That nightmare of a woman seemed to get a kick out of imitating me. Did this mean the next time she appeared, jumping out of some dark closet or unfolding herself from the back seat of my car, she'd be dressed in my clothes? Clothes I'd once loved, now blooded and filthy. Jewelry my mother and father had given me draped around her neck. "My husband?" I asked the nearest policeman once he was done with the questions, notebook folded, standing up. He was getting ready to leave. "Have you heard from my husband?" "He's on his way." Tired beyond belief, I fell backwards and began to cry. The policeman, clearly aware of what I'd been through, let himself out without another word, and I lay there alone for what must have been hours. I think I passed out again, or just fell into a very deep sleep. When I awoke, it was to the feeling of cold morning light filtering through the half-closed blinds. Slowly, I realized that I'd stirred to the gentle and reassuring sound of my husband's voice. "Hello?" I smiled at the realization he had come, and the familiarity that the sound of his voice brought. The feeling of safety. After everything I'd gone through, it meant the world to me to have him so close again. I turned over and saw him standing there, facing away from me. "Daniel?" I tried to keep my voice clear, but got less than halfway through his name before it turned into a great big sob. "Oh, thank God you're here." "Who are you?" I frowned. The choice of words confused me, but my husband didn't move or turn to face me. That in itself was enough to make me sit upright. "Daniel?" I repeated. "What are you doing in my room? Get the hell out of here." "Dan?" "Jeez!" The sudden exclamation made me jump. My heart rate spiked. Some machine close by began to screech. But still, my husband did not move. "Jeez, what the hell are you?" he continued. "Oh my God!" He began to scream while remaining perfectly still with his hands behind his back, head tilted to one side. Just as suddenly as the crying out had begun, it stopped as several medics began to race into the room to check on me. My head grew light. The world began to spin. Slowly, at last, my husband turned to face me as the nurses crowded around, asking a dozen questions, none of which I seemed to hear. I saw his face. God, his face. A grin as wide as his head, bloodshot eyes, greasy hair, and a sort of dazed, drug-addled look. When he spoke one final time, his lips did not move, but behind that strange and warped mouth, there was the barely visible glint of vibrating black carapace. "What are you?" he said, a dying rattle. One last exclamation before he turned to leave. The others in the room were oblivious to him, focused as they were entirely on me as a dozen alarms went off. As I watched him leave, a sickening realization dawned on me. One that threatened to crowd out the last vestige of consciousness. That thing was his doppelganger, and he had been repeating my husband's dying words right back at me. A few years ago, I was invited to a dinner party. It wasn't that fancy, just a few old friends reconnecting. People I hadn't seen since high school. Some of the people on that list were people I hadn't seen or heard of for years, so it'd be a nice opportunity to catch up. My wife couldn't come though, invites only. She didn't mind. I looked forward to it all week. I took out my old Tom Skog high school baseball cap and went through the guest list. There were a few names I recognized at the drop of a hat, and a few that I didn't. I figured some people had changed their names over the years. While it wasn't a proper reunion, more like a get-together of old friends, I still got the sense that there was something more to it. There was no anniversary coming up, so it sort of came out of nowhere. I got the impression that maybe something else was up, like a proposal or some other announcement. The big night took place on a Saturday, at a rented venture just outside of town, some old clubhouse. Nothing big or fancy, but enough to house the 8 partygoers that had pressed the "I will attend" button. I got there a bit early, dressed up in my favourite jacket, sporting the classic baseball cap. It smelled a bit like mildew, but what the hell. If there ever was a time to wear it, this was it. Rolling up to the house, the first person I ran into was the host herself. Jerry, short for Geraldine. She was the de facto head of the AV club back in high school. The elected president of the club was often missing or off doing their own thing, leaving Jerry to take care of the practicalities. If there was one person I'd bet on to arrange a night like this, it'd be her. She swept me up in a big hug, pulling a little on my baseball cap. "Oh, we're bringing out the big guns, huh?" She laughed. "Should have kept my club sweater. Gotta represent the Togs." The stupid name we used for the locals. It was still around. Over time, the others dropped in. Nellie, the overachiever, Ollie, or Ole, who was on the student council, Chris and Corey, the twins, Omar, who didn't move in until the final year, but instantly made himself part of the group. Finally, we just waited for Tess. It was getting late, so we figured she could catch up later. We had a couple of drinks and got snacking on some appetizers. Jerry had arranged for a catered meal. It didn't take long for us to fall back into our old roles, finding our way back to each other like we'd never left. There is a saying that the better you know someone, the less you need to talk to them. It really is true. It was just a matter of minutes before we were right back to where we left things all those years ago. But Tess was a no-show. I figured she'd run into some sort of last-minute issue, but Jerry wasn't convinced. If anything, Jerry was being a bit strange about it, avoidant. Halfway through the main course, Nellie checked her phone. She fell silent all of a sudden. It was hard to tell, since everyone else was laughing and chatting about, but I saw her lift her hand to her mouth, and her eyes stopped blinking. She'd seen something shocking. I gently elbowed Omar next to me, who noticed the same thing. Once the two of us quieted down, so did the others. It didn't take long for the entire table to notice. Nellie looked up at us. There's been an accident. I think Tess is not... She sniffled, putting down her phone. She buried her face in her hands, trying her best to hold back the tears. Everyone picked up their phones, trying to see if what she'd said was true. Checking local news, social media, anything. But I kept my eyes on Jerry. She was unnaturally quiet about this. It didn't take long for the room to devolve. Nellie was openly weeping. Olay just went pale, staring into the wall. Chris and Corey started arguing about the details as they differed from one source to the next. Omar just shook his head over and over, trying to convince himself it wasn't true. But of course, it was. Turns out Tess had some kind of aneurysm earlier that day. Out like a light the moment she sat down in her car. Completely unavoidable and undetectable. It just took some time for people to notice, since it looked like someone just sitting in their car. But Jerry just sat there, sipping a wine. She didn't look at her phone, and she didn't join the conversation. There was a shake to her hand, like she was suddenly nervous. I wanted to pull her aside and ask her about it, but there was no space. People were talking over one another, calling out, demanding my attention. All the while, Jerry didn't move a muscle. Then, the power went out. It went completely dark. For a moment, all I could see were faces lit up by smartphone screens like ghastly apparitions. I joined in, and so did Jerry. The discussion just died as we all looked at one another. At some point, someone turned their phone towards the table, as if looking for something. As the light panned across the room, we all noticed, in unison, a shape. It was only there for a fraction of a second. Something tall, dark and spectral. Arms that reached all the way to the floor. Something sickly thin and black as oil. There was a shrill screech, like the cables inside the walls were burning, screaming for help. This high-pitched burn, something overloading, bathing the room in the smell of burnt plastic and gypsum. In the blink of an eye, the power returned, and with it, the dark disappeared. The room erupted. Nellie was on her feet, backing away from the table. Ollie crouched down. The twins just stood up, looking lost. Omar just froze, not knowing what to do. But my eyes landed on Jerry and what she was doing. She just sat there, staring at the space where the dark thing had stood. As the room fell silent, I caught her attention. "What's going on?" I wheezed. What was that?" Jerry shook her head. As the rest of the room turned their attention to her, she began stuttering. Her eyes shifted from one to the next, until she finally gave in. It's hard to explain." So now we got the real story. It started a couple of months ago. It started with a woman named Gwen. She had been an acquaintance at best, someone that most of the group hadn't interacted much with. She was part of another clique in a way, and there wasn't much crossover between the groups. She had suddenly passed, leaving some former classmates devastated. Tess had heard about it somewhere in a social peripheral. One post in particular had stood out. In one of the memorial comment sections, someone mentioned, "She knew this was coming. She'd seen the spectre of death. She told me, and I think she was at peace." After that, There'd been 2 more deaths, a man and a woman, both dropping dead within a month of one another. Again, vague hints to seeing something and a spectre. But this time, Tess knew them a little better. In fact, she talked to one of them just weeks ahead of their death. 2 things became apparent. 1, that they were being followed by something, and 2, that they knew their time was running short. By that 3rd death, Tess figured it was no longer a coincidence. Their old friends were dropping like flies. She reached out to Jerry to kind of get the gang together to talk about it, but only days ahead of the reunion, she'd started to see the spectre herself. "She wanted us to go ahead, with or without her," said Jerry. "She knew this would happen." "So, what does it mean?" Nellie asked. "We all saw it. Are we all next?" Jerry shook her head as the questions rained. "What the hell is that?" yelled Corey. "Were you going to tell us?" Chris joined in. Question after question after question. Finally, Jerry just slumped into a chair, still shaking her head. "I don't know," she repeated over and over. I just don't know." Ollie was the first to react. He headed for the door. "I'm getting the hell out of here," he yelled. "Screw this." The moment he opened the door, the power was cut again. My phone was glowing hot in my hand, overloaded by static electricity. All the illuminated faces flickered as our phones struggled to stay alive. In the vague flicker from one of our phone screens, I only caught a glimpse of it. A figure so tall we couldn't see the head as it loomed outside the door. An impossibly long arm reached in. Ollie just screamed, devolving into a series of ever-repeating no, no, no's, until he was silenced. It took longer for the lights to return now. When they did, Ollie was curled up on the floor like a dying bug, face frozen in surprise and horror. He was already pale as limestone, his eyes glazed over, a single tear in the corner of his frozen eye, dead as a doornail. The room erupted into panic. Jerry screamed at them to stop. The twins headed for the back door, only for the lights to go out again. I could hear a bulb pop from the fridge, and I could smell something burning. The scene played out as if through a strobe light, as light bulbs struggled to come back to life. Little snapshots of chaos burned into my retinas. Chris dropped immediately in the doorway. Corey made it all the way back to the dinner table before he collapsed, an impossibly long arm touching the back of his head. He fell haphazardly forward, breaking the 2 legs at the short end of the table. He pulled down most of the tablecloth, along with the plates and glasses. Carefully prepared mimosas and half-drunk wine bottles spilled onto the floor, mixing with froth and dust. He was dead before he hit the ground. Omar panicked, but Nellie managed to hold him back. Jerry was hiding in the corner. I was just standing there, like a deer in headlights, trying to remember how to breathe. I had never been the one with a fight-or-flight instinct, like a genetic thing. Nellie shook her head. "I have to do regular checkups for work," she said. "I got a clean bill." We went through a checklist of things, trying to figure out an answer to why us. It was the only thing we could do. Our phones were dead, and no one dared to leave. We just stood there, our thoughts running away from us at the speed of panic. It didn't make sense. We were different genders, backgrounds, ethnicities, and religions. We had different occupations, aspirations, hopes, and dreams. For all intents and purposes, we were wildly different people, The only thing tying us together was our association with one another and our shared time at Tomskog High. At one point, we'd all curled up against the walls. I hugged my knees close to my chest. I couldn't look at Jerry without my eyes crossing paths with Corey's body, curled up like a dead bug, fingers twisted and turned in a painful final expression. I opted to just not look at her, instead speaking generally to the room. "So, that's it then?" I said. "There's no reason. We're just screwed. We tried to leave, and we're screwed." "That can't be," said Omar. "Then why wait? Why not just kill us?" "None of this makes sense," muttered Nellie, shaking her head. "Why now?" That was a good question. We considered what had been going on in our lives lately. I mentioned moving into a new house with my wife, who'd started a new job as a realtor. Nellie talked about accepting a position in Minneapolis. Omar was moving to South Dakota to be with her sick mother. Jerry had been working remotely for a company in Dallas for years, and only recently they decided to enforce a return to office policy. There were no obvious patterns. Relationships, families, jobs. It all looked very different. Omar tried a different approach. "Maybe it's more practical," he said. "Maybe we have to leave as a group." "Why?" "I don't know. I don't even know what it is. So let's look at it rather than us. Let's look at what it's doing," I said. "It's keeping us here. It wants us to be here. We're safe now, right?" We all looked around, as if to make a point. We were indeed safe, for now. But despite it all, no matter how much logic we tried to apply to it, I couldn't wrap my brain around what we'd been looking at. Some kind of otherworldly entity tearing through us without any kind of retaliation. Or maybe there was. Nellie argued that we should attack it. We'd seen it, so it was some kind of physical entity. It had a shape, a form. That in itself should mean that it could be destroyed. Slowly getting off the floor, we looked at what we had. A few broken table legs as clubs. Jerry figured we could try using salt, as it was supposed to have some sort of supernatural properties on non-worldly entities. Omar figured trying a cross wouldn't hurt. We armed ourselves to the best of our abilities, figuring we should try something as a group. If it really was a physical entity, that meant it was constrained by its own properties, meaning it couldn't catch all of us at once. So, instead of moving as a pile of pigs to the slaughter, we would spread out, scattering to the wind. It was risky, but it was all we got. Omar positioned himself by the front door with a table leg. Jerry got the back door with a frying pan. Nellie and I took windows on the opposite sides of the room. She armed with another table leg, while I used the roast pan as a shield and a kitchen knife. We reviewed the plan again. We would go on 5, heading in different directions. Once out, we would be calling for help. If confronted by the entity, we would be using what we had to force it back just enough to run. We hadn't seen it move much, so maybe it wasn't that fast. It was a risky, stupid plan, but we were desperate. Nellie counted down from 5. I held my hand on the window, watching the others follow suit. As the countdown continued, I could feel the strength in my arm wane, like everything in me just wanted not to run, but to crawl into a corner and just wait. And yet, the countdown reached 0. Nellie flung the window open, Omar kicked the front door open, Jerry pushed into the back door. And me. I realized my window was locked. The reaction was immediate and violent. Out of every window and every door, dozens of shade-like appendages appeared. Knife-sharp, bone-like fingers reached for us. The windows were blown apart by the pressure, covering my hand in 100 little cuts, shattered pieces of glass boring into my hair. I didn't fight. That instinct just wasn't there. I scrambled backwards, doing exactly what my instinct taught me to make myself as small and invisible as possible. Omar fought, Nellie too. Jerry actually managed to hit something. I could hear the thwunk of the frying pan, but it was quick. No screams. As the lights died, I saw Jerry's head being grasped as she was dragged outside. Her heart stopped before she even dropped the frying pan. Nellie got halfway across the room before they got to her, making a faceplant into the hardwood floor in a morbidly comical manner. An entire life snuffed out, ending with an embarrassing self-inflicted nothing. Omar just stood there as one of the things loomed over him. It reached for him, and he did nothing. It was calm, collected, even reverent in a way. But as what looked like a thumb approached his forehead, he started shaking his head. "No," he pleaded. "No, I can't. Not like this." And with that, he fell to the floor, empty. They made no sound. Dozens upon dozens of spectres poured into the room, surrounding me. I wanted to scream, but my breath was stuck in my throat. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was so far from the world I knew that it started to feel like a bad dream. It simply couldn't be well and truly real. But feeling that cold hardwood floor against my cheek made me think differently. I looked up, only to see one of the spectres looming over me, so tall that its head cut through the ceiling. It reached for me, a thumb-like appendage reaching for my forehead. And in that moment, it spoke to me. Less of a voice, and more of a series of impressions. It's hard to explain. It showed me flashes of a life, me settling down with my wife, growing little blue sunflowers in the backyard, having kids, growing old and dying on a park bench near Frog Lake, never leaving the little Minnesota town where I'd grown up. A long, peaceful and uneventful life. Little spots of sunshine and joy along a grey path, one I'd willingly bind myself to. But then it showed me something else. A different world, full of dark shapes in an endless desert of black sand. There I wondered as another faceless thing, saying nothing, doing nothing. And there was no end. Burning hellscapes where my flesh was reforming as fast as it melted from my bones in a perpetual cycle of pain. In another place, I was stuck in an empty, starless void, where my being was spread among dying stars, eternally drifting. In another, I was floating on a sensationless ocean, staring up at a night sky where a single red eye the size of a moon stared back. I was a consciousness bound to stages of life I could never break free from. It was an invitation. They were asking me to stay here, there, and forever. That's what had killed the others. They had wanted to leave. I finally understood. I wasn't running, I wasn't leaving. I was staying in this town, while the others had been eager to settle elsewhere. But this invitation wasn't just about me, and the here and now. This was about an endless multitude of existences waiting to happen, one where an end was not promised. A perpetual me, bound to whatever form necessary, like them, like all of them. I could feel myself shaking my head into a no. I could feel my tongue licking the roof of my mouth, looking to push out that N. But I couldn't. I froze. Yes, I cried. Yes, of course. A cold thumb touched me, as if drawing an invisible mark across my forehead. And that was it. One by one, they left. They'd gained what they came for. A recruit. Someone to stay with them, to join their group at an unfathomable cost. The final one left with a breeze, knocking over my Tomskog High baseball cap. Home of the Togs. I just stood there, alone. Contorted remains of people I used to know littered the floor. Husks. The lights came back on, phones buzzing across the room, pings from missed calls and messages. But after all the notifications died down, all that was left was me, sobbing on the floor, doomed. You might have heard about all this, but in another way. They blamed it all on wine poisoning. There was a sham investigation. I think something around 2,000 bottles were recalled. Not a single soul believed my testimony, and my lawyer recommended me to retract my official statement, as it would either send me to a madhouse or get me in legal trouble. Perjury, maybe. Instead, I said that I simply didn't drink any wine, that I had settled for a beer. That in itself was a lie, but everyone was willing to believe it. Perhaps they all knew there was more to it. Perhaps they didn't care. A few years down the line now, I have 2 daughters. I have a nice job. My wife and I get along well, caring for the house together. It is a good life, but I can't help but to get that nagging feeling that I've doomed myself, that there was something waiting for me that I can't come back from, that maybe, at the end of all this, I am the one getting the raw deal, and not the shriveled up corpses that I left behind in that clubhouse. They say that you never really leave the small town life, that it follows you through your life, one way or another. I never thought it'd be this literal. The knock on the van window might as well have come from outer space. Pitch black, parked up on the side of a country road, and in a metal box being pummeled by a storm that had left half the country underwater. My wife and I practically jumped out of our skins at the rat-tat-tat on the driver's side window. I could see nothing except rivulets of water pouring down the window, and the sudden idea of someone leering at us on the other side made me deeply uncomfortable. I hesitated for a moment before I wound the window down. Couldn't help but think of hook-handed men and lonely couples stuck in the middle of nowhere. But when I heard the muffled sound of someone trying to talk to us, I swallowed the worst of my nerves and pressed the button to wind the window down. "Wouldn't stay here." The old man shoved his whole head through the window so it could be heard over the storm. I couldn't help but cringe backwards, and I was reminded of being in a safari with the window down, the way the wild beasts come pushing in looking for food. Thankfully, my wife, Leslie, managed to stammer out a reply before any awkward silence could fester. Pardon?" "Can't stay here," he repeated. "This lane will be underwater by midnight." "Oh," I replied. "Damn." I was feeling fairly deflated by this point. I hadn't pulled up in the middle of nowhere to sleep in a van because it was my first choice. We'd arrived here only after spending a good 6 hours trying hotel after hotel, only to find they were either underwater or booked to the gills with people escaping the floods. "Do you know anywhere we could go?" Leslie asked. "We just need somewhere to park up." The old man grimaced and shook his head. "Not around my land, sorry. Ain't falling for that again." He looked in the back as he said this, as if to gauge who we were. Might have been the bong, or my friends Ryan and Meg lying stoned in a sleeping bag, but something back there amused him. He let out a nasty little snort laugh. "No way, ain't having squatters again. Best bet would be the Weeping Ram," he added. "The what?" "Hotel, about half-hour up the road." "What was it called?" Leslie asked. "The Weeping Ram?" She immediately began typing on her phone, but the old man gestured with his hand for her to stop. "Won't find it online, love," he said. "Look, you go straight and take the third right." Leslie, diligent as ever, took meticulous notes as he spoke, but I had to fight not to roll my eyes. Something about the old man had rubbed me the wrong way, and once he left, I said as much. "Half tempted to just stay here," I said as I played with the keys in the ignition. "He probably just wants us out the area, unhappy with the undesirables lurking so close to his land." "Yeah, but if it floods, we're in real trouble." Ryan appeared out the back, red-eyed and tired, but clearly having paid more attention than I thought. "Please don't sink my van. It is literally my only possession in life." "He's right," Leslie added. "We can't risk getting caught in the flood." "What's this place meant to be like then?" I asked. "Don't know," Leslie shrugged. "I can't find anything about it online." "Quaint as hell," Ryan said with an easygoing nod of the head. "Old world offline vibes, like some ancient B&B or something." "Bloody creepy is what it is," I replied. "Nothing about it online?" Leslie, still scrolling, shook her head. "Better hope we don't end up starring in the West Country Chainsaw Massacre," I grumbled. Nobody laughed. So, with a bit of a grimace, I turned the keys and began to pull the van out of the banking I'd parked on. Leslie smiled and gave my leg a reassuring squeeze before feeding me the first of many directions to come. "At least we know it has vacancies," I said as I rolled the van to a stop on an empty gravel lot. "Is that a thatch roof?" Leslie cried while ignoring me. "Oh my god, it is!" Meg cooed, her blonde hair and round face making a brief appearance by the front seats. "Let's get in there and take a look." She quickly disappeared back into the rear of the van where her and Ryan set about gathering their things. "Oh, come on, Mark. It is quaint," Leslie said. I couldn't help but grimace. This funny-looking pub we'd been sent to by some stranger was in the middle of nowhere, situated in a small valley between two stony hills, with a view overlooking an overgrown field below. The land might once have been used for farming, if only for grazing animals, but now it looked desolate and dingy. Rain-lashed thorns and thistles and spiky thickets of grass were just about the only thing we'd seen in our headlights on the way up. And sure, the Weeping Ram was somewhat quaint, with its expansive thatch roof and a hand-painted sign of a pained-looking sheep that swung fitfully in the wind, its lumpen white plaster facade adding to the medieval rustic vibe. But I got the feeling the place was going to be full of cobwebs and spiders and dust and miserable old locals with no sense of humour. And where the hell were we? The stormy night had eaten the road behind us, erasing all sense of time and place as we drove down a muddy gravel lane, until out of nowhere the turning the old man had warned us about appeared and led us to the pub. With the rest of the country running in circles because of the storm, I couldn't shake the feeling we'd crawled into a forgotten corner of the world, one best left alone. Did people really come here to get drunk or stay for the night? Did people drive here to come to work, or to eat, or cook, or serve drinks? It wasn't just out of place with the internet age, it seemed out of place with civilization itself. My suspicions were confirmed once inside. There was barely enough room for the four of us to cram into the small, poorly lit corridor, so Ryan peeked ahead and found the main drinking hall off to the right. Passing through, our feet scuffed an ancient stone floor, and I noted the horsehair plaster on the walls that likely predated the First World War. It reeked of mildew and damp, and yet the air seemed dry and musty at the same time. There were only 4 tables and 2 booths for drinkers, and a dark, hardwood bar that some potato-faced man likely served booze from. But for now, it was all deserted. No patrons, no bartender. The only sign of life was the faint flicker of light from the candlelight sconces. "Oh my God, this is crazy," Megan cried, grabbing Les's arm to draw attention to the light fittings. "Look at that." Leslie agreed enthusiastically, but I tuned it out as I walked up to the bar and ran a finger across its greasy grain. It was dusty as hell, like it had gone unused for years. Behind the counter were a few racks for spirits, a couple taps, and a single door that led into some unlit space. Could have been a kitchen or a storeroom, had no way of knowing. But I stared into the darkness and felt an uncomfortable sensation gather in my stomach. It looked like something was moving back there. But why would someone be lurking in the dark? "Do you think the owner's back there?" I didn't hear Leslie approach, so I couldn't hide my fear when she spoke, jumping like some spooked child. She made no mention of my overreaction, not even a chuckle, and for some reason, that bothered me more than if she'd teased me about it. "Let's see," I said, and went behind the bar and into the darkness. Using my torch as a light, I scanned the room, seeing a dusty old kitchen with pots and pans that hadn't been used for years. Left to right and left again. I looked carefully for some sign of life. I was sure I'd seen someone moving around. I stepped deeper into the kitchen, and when my light caught the leering grin of an old woman, it took all my resolve not to cry out. Without meaning to, I dropped my phone and went to pick it up while stammering out the best greeting I could given the circumstance. "Excuse me," I cried, unable to shake the image of the strange-looking face I just glimpsed in a dark room. "Sorry, I didn't mean to intrude or anything, it's just we were directed here by—" The words stopped dead in my mouth when I stood up and brought the light up. There she was again, that old woman, eerie grin and wide eyes, pallid white skin, hands held together in front of her like an elderly headmistress supervising some exam. And she hadn't moved since I'd last laid the torch on her. Not an inch, not a millimeter even. There was no motion to her, no breath, no reaction, not even the constant darting micro-movements of the human eye that are barely perceptible, but always, always there. Somewhere, my mind told me this must be a mannequin, not a person. Too uncanny, not right. And yet, it couldn't be. She was so lifelike. I couldn't help but take a few steps towards her, noticing faint, downy hair along her cheeks, liver spots by her hairline, and 1,000 other details that I refused to believe were the product of some crazy artist working with wax. But her eyes did not even dilate when the torch glinted directly off their glassy surface. No human could stand in darkness and have a torch beamed into their eyeballs and not even flinch. It just wasn't possible. "Oh my God," I muttered before realizing I had to show the others this incredible find. Slowly, I backed out of the room, not yet willing to turn my back on that creepy thing, and found the others admiring the old wood-burning fireplace in the corner of the room. "Any luck back there?" Leslie asked when she saw me. "Jeez, guys," I cried breathlessly. "You won't believe—" I was interrupted by the urgent cry of a brittle feminine voice. "Oh no, just look at you poor things." The old woman appeared behind us as if out of nowhere, and my stomach hit the floor. With a warm smile and gentle, grandmotherly tone, she swept past me and towards my friends, where she immediately began cooing over them. "Oh, you're drenched. Look at you. How on earth did you make it up here in this weather? You must be freezing and hungry too." The others reacted normally, as anyone might when greeted by a friendly old landlady. But I stood rooted to the spot, not sure if what I was seeing was even real. Her clothes were identical to the thing in that room, as was her hair and face. Everything was the same, except for that deeply unsettling expression, that ever so slightly too wide grin that had terrified me just seconds before in the dark was gone, replaced with a surprised but welcoming smile. While everyone was busy being fawned over, I quickly backtracked into the kitchen and shone my light at the corner. It was empty. "Mark," Leslie called, and I went back into the lounge. "Mark, come on. This is Bernadette. She's going to show us to our rooms." "We're not strictly open for business," the woman said, with what seemed to me to be not quite sincere concern. "But I cannot possibly turn anyone away in weather like this." She smiled at Leslie, and then at me. And for the briefest of moments, hidden in the fractions of a second where Leslie wasn't looking, the old woman winked at me. Leslie asked what was wrong, and I wasn't sure how to answer. Right there and then, sat on our bed where it was warm and safe, just the two of us. There wasn't much, if anything, wrong at all. It felt all too easy to ignore the strangeness I'd just experienced, so that's what I did. I shrugged it off, told Leslie everything was okay, and settled into bed beside her. But not before locking our door. After that, I crawled under the covers, pulled my wife close, and shut my eyes. Sleep came surprisingly quickly, although there were a few flashing images of that deathly white face haunting me in my dreams. I couldn't say what woke me. I came to with a faint impression of a loud noise just outside the room, subtly aware of a cold breeze on my right side where Leslie should have been. Now, she was gone, the covers thrown back and the bed beside me empty. Disoriented, I pulled myself upright and immediately went stumbling to the door looking for her. Arms wrapped around my bare chest to stay warm, I poked my head out into the corridor and saw nothing except darkness. Again, that subtle, almost subconscious idea of movement in the inky black. "Leslie," I called out and waited, straining to hear something, anything, over the roaring of the rain against the pub's ancient walls. Something might have moved around in response, but I wasn't sure. It was like listening for voices in white noise. The brain can play tricks on you. Nervous and wishing that I could just crawl into bed and pretend that nothing was wrong, I went back into the room and got dressed and turned the lights on. When I returned to the corridor with the help of my room light, I could now see the doors of the other guest rooms stretching down the hallway before fading into darkness. And there, at the very threshold of the light, was someone's phone, the screen broken and the edges dented. I picked it up and could tell from the astrological stickers on the back it belonged to Meg. The door to her and Ryan's room was empty, and looking inside, I saw that the bed was ruffled and unmade, and Ryan's phone was still plugged into a power bank near the mattress. But where were they? And why was there only one of his trainers lying upside down halfway between the bed and the door? It was like he'd been trying to pull his shoes on when something interrupted him. "What the hell?" I muttered quietly as I panned my torch across the room. God, I wanted this little nightmare to be over with. Ever since I'd seen that terrifying old woman standing in the corner of that kitchen, frozen in place like some lifelike wax dummy, I felt as if I walked right into the Twilight Zone. But I didn't know how to go about it. All I could think of was to go back out into the corridor and try crying out for Leslie. Les, come on, where are you?" This time, there was a definite sound. A muffled but clearly audible thump that came from one of the doors off further down the hallway. It sounded like it had come near the stairs, and that made sense. If the others were off moving around, they weren't going to stick around in the empty guest portion of the house, just empty doors and creaking floorboards. No, they'd probably go downstairs to find the old woman. I paused at the top of the stairwell and waited, listening for some confirmation that the others were safe and sound. I hoped I might hear them laughing and chatting, maybe sharing a drink. "Guys?" Another thump. This time, it definitely came from below. Quietly tiptoeing like some scared child, I slunk down the hardwood stairs, pressing my feet to the edges of each step where I knew the wood would be strongest and least likely to make noise. Down one floor and down another. The sound of something moving deep within the building drew me on further into what felt like a nightmare. But I couldn't just turn back. A part of me remained convinced that any second, reality and common sense would reassert themselves, that everything would snap back into place where it was meant to be. I'd find the others laughing and enjoying a drink. Maybe the girls had gone off for a chat and Ryan followed, and now I would do the same. Maybe there'd been a medical emergency. Meg might have fallen and the others were attending to her. Anything might explain why I'd woken up on that floor alone, crying out, only for no one to reply. A lifetime of experience had taught me that childish fears went away when you shone a light at them. But then again, I had never experienced anything like that woman standing in the darkness. On the ground floor, just as the tight spiral staircase opened out into another hallway, I'd spotted a gentle amber glow. It came from an open doorway some way down the corridor. I was drawn to the first sign of life I'd seen since waking up, and pushed the door open, hoping to find my friends gathered around a fire. Instead, I found something out of a surreal nightmare. Dogs, cats, foxes, rabbits. 40, maybe 50 animals lined the walls and shelves. Stiff cotton stuffed faces and glassy eyes glaring at me from every nook and cranny of a cramped, humid room. Of course, in the country, it isn't uncommon to come across something like this. We'd stayed in a hotel in Scotland just a few weeks before, with an enormous deer head mounted over the bed. But this room wasn't some big showy affectation. It felt private, like someone actually came to that place and sat on a single empty chair looking for comfort. And no one would have ever been proud of bagging these animals. No majestic deer or threatening bears. Instead, these animals were all of the sad and small variety. There was a Dalmatian in one corner, its head slightly misshapen, a weasel missing 2 legs on a cabinet, a badger with no head, and enough rabbits to make a warren. All of them riddled with myxomatosis that left them ugly and deformed. This was not some grand display of nature's majesty. It was, at best, the showcase of an amateur taxidermist who scavenged Britain's motorways for his subjects. So where was the amateur taxidermist? And where were my friends? Hello? I had to force the lone word out of my mouth. Again, I was looking for that sense of reality and normality. I wanted to dispel the childish fear that was gripping me tighter and tighter with each passing second. Sure, things were weird, but so what? Something moved. My heart seized as my eyes darted left and right, desperately trying to make sense of what my mind insisted could not have actually happened. The room was well lit, but so full of dusty fur and old furniture, it was impossible to say. Too many shadow-lined shelves, too much space to keep track of. Was I sure anything had moved at all? I took a step further into the room and tried to make sense of it all. If I had seen something move, where? My gut told me the movement had come from the corner with the Dalmatian. I took a closer look at it and grimaced. I love dogs, love them dearly, but I didn't love that one. For a start, it was dead. Whoever had set out to remake it might have had good intentions. But come on, you can't just stuff Fido full of sawdust and call it anything other than a pile of dog-shaped sawdust. Draping the poor animal's skin over it does nothing for me except make my skin crawl. And that goes for good taxidermy, the kind you might find on display in some eccentric's house. But this Dalmatian was all out of shape. Its abdomen bulged irregularly, its eyes pointed in different directions, and its glossy, open mouth didn't bear the welcoming smile of a friendly canine, but instead the slack open-jawed expression of some malicious idiot. Thump. The sound that I'd been following returned, this time closer than ever before. It sounded like it had just been outside the hallway. I went and checked, staying close to the doorway where there was at least sufficient light. There seemed to be nothing. But when I turned back to the room full of animals, I felt a terrible, overwhelming sensation of wrongness. The Dalmatian was gone. In the dark, something brushed against my leg, and I heard the telltale click-clack of a dog's claws on hardwood floor. Spinning on the spot, I tried to follow it, but caught only the faintest hint of a white and black animal fading into the darkness of the corridor. My torch illuminated only 3 steps of the basement stairs. Looking up from the very bottom was the Dalmatian with its strange lumpen head. The rest of it remained in shadow. It waited patiently. It did not bark or pant like any normal dog. It stared expectantly, and so far I had followed it only out of some naive hope that it might lead me to my friends. But as time has gone on, as the evening has taken on more and more of that surreal, almost dreamlike quality that made me feel helpless and trapped, I could not escape the feeling the dog was leading me deeper into the nightmare and not out of it. This was not helped by the fact that as I'd followed it onwards into the strange hotel, passing old rooms full of rotting knickknacks and cobweb-covered doors. The strange thumping noise had grown louder and louder, like the pealing of a bell. There were times that it occurred to me to turn and leave, to get into the van and just go. Maybe I would have, if I'd been in a more normal state of mind. But I like to think I would never abandon my wife or my friends. I may have been afraid, but I wasn't a coward. "Leslie?" Again, I hoped that she would suddenly appear, the lights would come on, the ever-present dread would be pushed back. But there was nothing. I stood at the threshold of the basement stairs and knew, sooner or later, I'd have to follow the dog. Down in the darkness, someone groaned, and it made me realize I could wait no more. A woman was down there, and I was certain it was Leslie who'd made it. As if on cue, the dog disappeared, like it knew I was going to follow now, no matter what. Heart racing, I descended and found myself in a crowded, dusty basement full of old rubbish and soggy boxes. The roof leaked in a half-dozen places, and with the storm in full effect, the ground had flooded by about 6 inches, so that my feet were completely submerged in filthy-looking water. Somewhere in the basement, I could still hear the dog's paws cut through the water in a lazy, sloshing canter. I was looking around the basement with my phone as a torch, trying to see where it was leading me, when something caught my eye. A stony, cylindrical structure in one far corner. It was an old well, common enough in a house of the era, but in an unusual touch, it had been sealed shut with a heavy wooden lid. Something about that enormous slab of blackened timber seemed odd to me. It wasn't merely a safety feature. It looked like the sort of thing you'd seal a tomb with. Behind me came another splash. This was different to the quiet patter of the dog. It was like something or someone dropping into the water. I turned towards the sound and saw Bernadette, her face twisted into another hideous grin, eyes wide and excited. I let out a cry and stumbled backwards, but by the time I managed to get back onto my feet, the old woman was gone. Close to panic, I swept my light around me and found her. She had moved and was close to my back, but she was frozen again, unreactive, like another piece of taxidermy. I wanted to run away at the sight of her standing so close, but somehow I just knew if I took my torch away again, she'd disappear, and I might not have time to find her before her bony fingers found me in the dark. Instead, I stayed in one place and slowly backed away. "Mark?" The sound of Leslie's voice hit me like a freight train. I gasped, turned instinctively towards her, and then back again to find that Bernadette had already disappeared. Aware that she might be anywhere, I focused on my wife, finding myself overcome with emotion, both good and bad, as my eyes took in the strange state of her. She looked pale, disoriented, and afraid. She stood there in a t-shirt and underwear, freezing cold, looking almost sick. But at least she was there. At least she was right in front of me. At last, some elements of this nightmare was giving way. "Geez, babes, what happened?" I said as I wrapped my arms around her. "I don't know," she mewed like a sick child. "I had these nightmares, and I woke up here. I think I was sleepwalking. I dreamt I was a little boy speaking to something in a well. I had a sister, I had a dog. The voice in the well wanted me to... God, it made me do such strange things." I couldn't help but look at the well in the corner. Her eyes followed mine, and she grimaced. "I don't like this place. Can we go?" God, it feels so weird here. Am I still dreaming? She walked forward and practically fell into my arms. With one arm wrapped around her, I held her upright and led her towards the stairs. Part of me wanted to ask about Meg and Ryan, but I knew it was more important to get her somewhere safe. We had climbed just a few stairs when I heard the sudden sound of someone barreling towards us at a sprint, their feet splashing in the water with stomach-churning speed. I turned just in time to see the old woman, face still twisted, coming out of the dark. Instinctively, I pushed Leslie ahead of me, but Bernadette was more interested in me. With an icy, hard grip, she grabbed my ankle and yanked me down. My head hit one of the steps, and for a brief moment, everything went a little wobbly. The next thing I was aware of was water rising to my ears and the sight of the basement steps receding away. Something was pulling me deeper into the dark. I tried to struggle, but a hard, rubbery hand refused to let go of my ankle. I kicked hard with the other leg, hitting Bernadette in the small of her back. To my disgust, my foot hit something like densely packed hay, or maybe even wood. It certainly wasn't flesh. Slowly, Bernadette turned to face me, her head pivoting like an owl's, while her body kept facing the other way. "My brother will look after you," she said. "He has a gift for putting people back together after they've fallen apart. Always had, even as a little boy. You don't realize just how hurt you are. None of you do. But that's okay. My brother is good at putting things back together." Still facing me, eyes wide and manic, she pulled me towards what I slowly realized was the well in the far corner of the basement. "He scrapes away the scars and wounds and replaces the broken bones and withered muscles with fresh, clean, perfumed sawdust. Puts you back together one bit at a time. Did you know how hurt you were? Did you see the cuts and scars across your faces and hands? I did." She stopped at the well. With one arm and freakish strength, she effortlessly lifted the wooden slab. And so did he, even in the dark. He could see the bleeding inside and out, full of it, full of blood. You're all so full of blood. You needed help, just like me. The smell that came out of that pit was nauseating, and realizing what was about to happen, I started to kick and punch, grabbing at any part of the old woman I could while trying my best to hurt her. But all that came away beneath my nails was papery skin and moldy sawdust that smelled of rotten meat. Bernadette climbed up to the lip of the well and swung me over the darkness. I couldn't help but look down into the inky abyss, where I caught sight of what looked like an oil leak on asphalt. A dark, murky collection of metallic colours, some of which I couldn't possibly describe in words. Slowly, something strange bobbed up from the foul fluid. A hand, gnarled and foul, began to break the surface and reach towards me. Just as I felt like my sanity was going to shatter into 1,000 pieces, I was thrown sideways into the water. There was a grunt and a struggle, and I looked up to see Leslie, her eyes clear for the first time since I found her, repeatedly hitting the old woman with a bit of wood. She was furious and unrelenting as she whacked Bernadette over and over. She had saved me, and for a moment, I fell in love with her all over again. But the romance didn't last long before my senses returned and I realized I couldn't just lie there. Desperate to help, I pulled myself to my feet and rushed over. Just in time as well. Leslie went for one final swing and Bernadette caught the plank of wood with an unflinching hand. Slowly, she tightened her grip and the wood began to splinter. But with all her attention on my wife, she failed to notice me charging towards her. With a good shove, I pushed her over the edge of the well and into the darkness below. We heard the thick, syrupy plop, and when we looked over, we saw her struggling in the filth below. Two eyes fixed us in the dark from a soot-covered face, and I knew we couldn't waste another second. I grabbed Leslie's elbow and ran. "Let's get the hell out of here," I cried as we scampered up the steps. Behind us, Bernadette let out a blood-curdling howl. A few hours later, and the sun was beginning to rise, we had pulled up the van on the side of the road to take a moment to ourselves and go over the strange events of the night before. The storm, starting to fade by now, had made a terrible mess of the roads, and it had taken us an infuriating few hours just to find another main road, as so many of the country lanes were blocked by fallen trees and branches. But now, with traffic passing us by and electric lights visible in the distance, we had finally found ourselves on the trail of civilization. "Geez," I said as the engine died and silence settled over us both. "Did that really happen?" Leslie simply shook her head. "It was a dream, right? The whole thing. I remember sleeping and someone coming to me, and I was definitely awake for my part of it," I replied. "I woke up in the middle of the night and you were missing, and I went looking. None of that was in my head. It felt surreal and all kinds of wrong, but it wasn't a product of my mind. It's hard for me to separate things. When I look back, one moment I'm a little boy scraping squirrels off the side of the road. The next, I'm me in the basement, that terrible old woman stroking my cheeks." I put my arm around her and pulled her close. "Where are the others?" she asked after a few moments. "I don't know," I replied while shaking my head. "God, Mark, we need to find them. Even if we just call the police and tell them where, we need to do something." "Do you have your phone?" I asked. "I'll call them." "No, do you?" "I lost it in the basement." I turned in my seat to look in the back, where I hoped I might find a spare phone or a laptop, something I could use to get help. But I froze in place when I saw Meg and Ryan's sleeping bag. It wasn't empty. Meg and Ryan, frozen with waxy skin and glassy eyes, lay side by side in the back of the van, holding hands, posed like cadavers or mannequins in some strange display. Dead, I figured. Surely dead. They had to be, taken first by Bernadette, hollowed out by whatever lay in the well, and added to the collection. But that was before I saw the gentle murmuring of Meg's bluish lips, and the way her eyes looked at me as I leaned over my seat to try and hear what strange words she was whispering. It wasn't until I was so close I could feel her icy breath and smell the strange chemicals that soaked her that I realized what she was muttering in feverish terror. "It hurts. It hurts. It hurts. It hurts. It hurts." I've always associated my birthday with that depressing time of year where the cozy autumn turns into an early winter decay, where colourful leaves die, leaving a withered brown shell behind. Still, people are expected to celebrate their birthdays. It's strange if one doesn't. I don't. My fiancée recently asked me why I never celebrate my birthday, and it's a hard one to explain. When you've been through something traumatic, everything sort of brings you back to that moment, one way or the other. And while I'd love to tell her about it, I don't think I can without sounding like a maniac. I thought I'd start by just telling my story anonymously and sort of go from there. It was the year I turned 13. Since You've Been Gone was blasting on the radio every hour of the day. My friends and I were quoting How I Met Your Mother religiously. It was a good time to be a kid. Since my birthday was in the middle of the school week, my big birthday plans were postponed until the upcoming weekend. Still, I couldn't complain. Birthday cake on a Tuesday didn't sound all that bad. I got home, had a small celebration with my parents, and opened a few presents. 2 new games for my PlayStation 2. I finished up my homework and browsed the net for a few hours ahead of my scheduled bedtime, when there was a knock at the door. We rarely had visitors, so to have someone knocking at our door at 10 p.m. was unusual, to say the least. My parents had already opened the door by the time I was halfway down the stairs. There was a man in a fancy jacket with a clipboard standing outside, along with 2 armed guards. I sort of fell into the middle of the conversation. "So, we need you to sign the consent forms and we'll get started," the clipboard man said. "Any questions?" "This can't be legal," my mum said. "And what kind of authority are you?" "Ma'am, this is an emergency. We have been authorized to bring anyone and everyone if need be. But I promise you, it'll be a less pleasant experience than what you could achieve here in the comfort of your own home." As the discussion continued, the armed men pushed into the house. They had a sort of checklist they were going through, asking questions as they poked and prodded. Someone mentioned a satellite phone, which we didn't have. I hurried back upstairs. From my window, I could see them putting wheel locks on our car. They were testing some sort of electrical equipment too, and as they did, I could see the internet connection on my computer disappear. My cell phone lost all bars, and while I didn't check, I suspected they'd done something to our landline as well. They were isolating us, putting us under some sort of lockdown. I still didn't have the slightest idea of who these people were. There were no patches, badges, ranks or symbols. Just a bunch of serious-looking men in windbreakers with visible gun holsters. After a few minutes, one of the men entered my room. My parents were worried sick, but were told to wait outside. The man was about 6'4" and had the look of someone who could kill me with his bare teeth if need be. Without a word, he started to go through my things. "You got any walkie-talkies?" he asked. "Any radio science projects, something like that?" "Nope," I said, shaking my head. "I got a PlayStation 2. "That can go online, right?" I never got the chance to answer before my mom added, "We don't let him play online games," she said. "It can't do that." As if to make sure, he pulled the power cable and dropped it in a sealed bag along with various knickknacks and keys they'd collected. They weren't taking any chances, and I wasn't playing my new games anytime soon, it seemed. As they finished up their impromptu house inspection, we were asked to gather downstairs. The fancy man with a clipboard cleared his throat, and the room fell deathly silent. Even my dad, who was usually a very assertive man, didn't have much to add to the conversation. That's how you knew it was serious. "For 72 hours, this and the surrounding neighborhoods are under lockdown," the man explained. "There is a localized problem related to a recent geological event which has caused some unexpected issues. I'm sure you've noticed some minor oddities as of late." "Like what?" my dad added. "Milk turning sour, houseplants getting a strange color tint, swarms of frogs cluttering the roads." My parents said nothing, but they nodded. Perhaps they'd seen something I hadn't. The man put down his clipboard as he explained calmly, "You have been exposed to something akin to a chemical. It reacts violently to the release of certain hormones which are associated with deep REM sleep. To ensure your safety, we are currently enforcing a temporary 72-hour ban on sleep." "Excuse me?" My dad took a step forward, but one of the armed men responded in kind. They both stopped before it had the chance to escalate. "Exposure was approximately 9 hours ago, meaning you have about 63 hours left to go. That'll be approximately 1 p.m. on Friday." "There's no way we can—" "This is non-negotiable. This is a matter of your security, sir. We have an emergency health service site, but I can promise you that it won't be pleasant. You will be chemically induced into sleeplessness for the full duration of exposure until the event has passed. It can cause long-lasting brain damage." We were handed a folder each, explaining our responsibilities and rights. An unmarked red folder with 3 papers. One explaining their right to force this upon us. Another explaining that we'd already signed the consent papers. And a third one was a form explaining exactly when we could go to sleep. There was also an inventory form explaining the items we were to have returned at the end of the containment. They left a box of 50 glass vials, some kind of 4-hour booster shots. The man explained how underage children were not to take more than one every 7 hours, and that my mother, if pregnant, shouldn't take any at all. Luckily, my mom wasn't pregnant. I'm an only child. We were also given fiber bars with some kind of hormone supplement, unmarked and unbranded, but warm. Maybe they were made recently. The packaging was sloppy at best. The fancy man was trying his best to explain, and I could see my parents were eager to listen, but I barely understood half of it. Instead, I looked at the armed guards. They looked exhausted. Maybe they too weren't allowed to sleep. One of them had his mouth open and almost drooled, blinking one eye at a time. I could have sworn he nodded off for a second, which prompted him to take a walk outside. "I don't know if we can do this," my mother complained. It's a lot to ask. We've only just—" "If at any point you can't do this, you need to call this number. It's the only number that works," the man said, pointing to the final line on the final page of the folder. "If someone falls asleep and can't be awakened within a few minutes, they're in terrible danger. If that happens, try to keep them awake by any means until we can get here to pick them up. And then they'll be taken to our site in Mankato, where they'll be chemically induced to stay awake." "So what exactly happens if someone doesn't make it?" my mom asked. "If we all just fall asleep?" The man shook his head, tapping the clipboard with his pen. "They will most probably die. Others might too." While they went into the kitchen to explain the details, the angry-looking guard approached me with a sealed bag, handed me back my PlayStation 2 power cable. He gave me a pat on the shoulder. "I checked with the tech team," he said. "You're good to go. And, happy birthday." I'd almost forgotten that it was my birthday. I appreciated the gesture, but I just couldn't bring myself to smile. I had too many questions bubbling in the back of my head, and I was too afraid to speak. They probably talked for another 20 minutes or so before the men left, leaving my parents and I alone in the kitchen. My mother was smoking under the kitchen fan. I'd only ever seen her smoke 2 times, once when she lost the job and another time when her father got sick. Smoking in the kitchen was a surefire way to tell something was wrong. Dad was sitting with his arms crossed, looking at the box of booster shots. "This is not a joke," my dad finally said. "This is very serious. We're all going to need to help each other to get through this." Mom said nothing, but I could see her hands trembling. She'd been crying. She was shaking so much that the ash from a cigarette didn't reach the ashtray, just plopped down on the stove. "We can't be alone," Dad continued. "We're gonna do our best to keep busy. You can play as many games as you want, but you can't fall asleep." "They gave back my power cable," I said. "Does that mean it's okay for me to use the PlayStation?" "It's okay," Mom coughed. "It's okay, honey. Play your games." For the first few hours, I didn't understand what the big deal was. No more school for the rest of the week, no bedtime and unlimited screen time. That didn't sound too bad. I gamed late into the night. Sly 2 and Ratchet & Clank were on the menu, and I had a blast. I got some snacks along with one of those fiber bars. They tasted like twigs and raisins, but it made my brain calm. Not tired, but it made it easier to focus. It also made it harder to shut my eyes, making my eyelids itch. All lights in the house were kept on all throughout the night. Mom and Dad kept playing music on the downstairs stereo, and they desperately tried to keep me engaged. I was engaged enough just playing games, so I think it was more for their benefit rather than mine. At 5 a.m, Dad took his first booster shot. I could hear it all the way from upstairs. He was cussing pretty hard. Apparently, those things tasted like a mix of stale rice and death. Mom took her first booster shot half an hour later, but she mixed it with orange juice. Apparently, that helped. By 7 a.m, even I was feeling it. I'd never been up all night playing games like that on a school day before. Sure, I'd pulled all-nighters with my friends, but it was usually something we prepared for. So, by early morning, I could feel myself nodding off. My parents were checking in on me every now and then, and decided to act. We were having family breakfast, pretending as if we'd already slept. "You're always cranky in the morning," Mum said. "Try to imagine this is just that, another cranky morning." I knew for a fact that they'd slipped one of those boosters into my cereal. I saw 3 empty vials on the counter, and I knew none of them had taken a second one yet. Still, I had little choice but to try. We weren't even halfway through the containment yet. As we finished our breakfast, we could hear commotion outside. I was upstairs brushing my teeth, watching through the hallway window. It was our neighbours. Larry Peterson, a 55-year-old man who worked the fishing supplies at the local mini-mall, crawled out of his front door. He was throwing up something black and blue onto the pavement. I'd never seen this man do anything more physical straining than trying to start a lawnmower, and now he was crawling on all fours like his life depended on it. I could hear his wife calling out from the inside. She was screaming at him, but I couldn't hear what. Larry got up and almost leapt into the back of his pickup truck in a show of athleticism I'd never seen from him before. It wasn't until his wife got out of the house that I could hear what she was saying. "Larry!" she cried. "Larry, wake up!" I saw Larry Peterson grab a wrench, get out of the truck, and grab his wife by the hair. Suddenly, a hand covered my eyes as my father dragged me away from the window. I could hear a scream turn into a gargle, followed by a hearty laugh, one I'd heard 1,000 times before. The same kind of laugh Larry Peterson would chuckle up whenever my dad tried to pull off a bad pun. My mind painted me a picture of what had happened, and it wasn't pretty. My dad spun me around and stared into my eyes. I could tell he wasn't himself. There were lines across his face that I hadn't seen before. "Stay with me and Mom," he said. "Don't look outside. People are getting sick." "Are we getting sick, Dad?" I asked, a yawn escaping me. He shook me a little, as if to make sure I was paying attention. "We'll be fine," he said. "It's just a matter of time, but I don't want you to see people getting hurt. Larry isn't feeling well." There was a knock on the front door. Dad took point as Mom hid in the bedroom. I remember standing on the top of the stairs, looking over the railing to the floor below. There was a violent, angry pounding on the door. Larry Peterson's soft chuckle coming from the other side. He didn't say anything. He just pounded on the door with his wrench, laughing as he tried to get in. He went around the house, rattling our windows. He didn't get far before we could hear a car roll up. There was a popping sound, but not like a gunshot. I think they tased him. By the time I could hear Larry Peterson get dragged off, my mom had come upstairs with a smile taped to her face, asking me to show her how far I'd gotten in my new fancy video games. She was clearly trying to keep me distracted, but I didn't mind. At that point, I wanted desperately to be distracted. I could imagine Larry Peterson on the other side of the door, his white t-shirt stained with that strange black and blue goo he'd thrown up, wielding that wrench with a manic grip. The thing was as large as my arm and solid metal. I never considered it a weapon, but thinking about it made my blood run cold. Had he really killed Mrs. Peterson? Why? Mom and I spent the next few hours playing video games. We also made a plan. We went through our old DVDs and decided on a watching schedule. She had originally planned a walk, but now we weren't to leave the house. She didn't want to say why, but I had the feeling that there was something outside the Petersons' house that she didn't want me to see. Bloodstains, maybe. I was too afraid to find out. My parents tried their best to keep the mood up, but I could tell it was getting to them. My dad was mostly just standing there, leaning against the door, staring straight ahead like in a trance. Mom tried to occupy herself by playing games and watching DVDs with me, but she was counting the minutes until she could get her next booster shot. I wasn't eager to take one. They made my stomach all queasy. We made it all the way until noon. Dad was having trouble staying up and kept washing his head with cold water. He tried to keep busy doing housework that he'd kept for a rainy day, but there were constant distractions. We could hear sirens in the distance, and at one point there was someone spraying our front door and windows with a high-pressure water hose, possibly to wash away the last traces of Larry Peterson. There were dog patrols going up and down the street, along with the occasional phone call. The one number that still worked, where someone called to make sure we were all awake and accounted for. By dinner time, Mom was having stomach troubles. Her shaking had gotten worse, and she was having trouble with sudden change of smells. Dad kept rubbing his eyes and checking his watch, getting up every 10 minutes or so just to move around. We had decided that we were going to play board games after dinner, but Mom was having trouble keeping herself from throwing up. We ended up just reheating a lasagna from a few days back. I didn't mind. Mom made amazing lasagna, but my appetite was quickly lost when I saw my mother barely keeping it together. She kept drooling and making this weird chugging sound. She was blinking slower and slower. Dad tried to get her to eat one of her fiber bars. but she just ran out of the kitchen, locking herself in the bathroom. It was touch and go for a while. I could feel my heart racing as Dad tried to convince her to unlock the door, but she just couldn't do it. After a while, she stopped responding. Dad had to break the handle with a hammer, but it was too late. She was already sleeping. I could hear her through the door. As the door burst open, Mom had only been asleep for a couple of seconds, a minute at most, but she was sitting on the toilet, her head leaning back, and something was coming out of her mouth. Black and blue, fingertips poking out over the edge of her lips. Her throat undulated. The moment Dad grabbed her, she tipped her head forward, coughing. Dad washed her face in the sink while yelling at me to wait in the other room. For a few minutes, I was just sitting there, ready to run or hide. It might have been too late, I figured. She could have already been affected, like Larry Peterson. I could hear them arguing in the other room, and as their voices went from angry to desperate to sad, I didn't know what to do. When they finally returned, they sat me down to explain that we were going to be fine, that we were almost halfway through, and that we were in the home stretch. They were so kind, warm, and careful in the way they explained it. But my mind was 1,000 miles away. I had trouble focusing, and all I could think about was that strange noise I kept hearing in the background. Something outside. Dad was halfway through explaining how we weren't going to lock our bathroom doors anymore when something in me screamed at me to react. It was just a slight click, but it was clear as day. Maybe it was the booster shots, but I kept hyper-focusing on little details rather than big picture stuff, like an actual conversation taking place in front of me. I closed my eyes, and no less than a second later, there was a loud bang. Someone was shooting at us. It was only a couple of shots, but we dropped to the ground. One shot got lodged in the front door, while the other cracked the kitchen window. There were loud voices outside, laughing hysterically. They were talking, but barely making any sense. One of them sounded like she was trying to talk with food in her mouth. Mom and Dad kept quiet as 2 more shots popped off, one of them hitting the kitchen light. With an electric spark, it gave out, blacking out most of the kitchen. I could hear someone running and laughing as they continued down the street. In the distance, there was more gunfire, maybe someone responding in kind. "We can't stay here," Mom whispered. "We gotta call them." "You want to go where they put Larry?" Dad answered. "To be in a whole hospital full of these people?" "They're shooting at us. We can't just..." Mom quieted down and looked at me. She and Dad excused themselves to talk in private while I was asked to move upstairs. I was to stay away from windows, and I couldn't sit or lie down. They'd be up to check on me in a bit. But of course, I was too curious. While still hearing them argue downstairs, I checked an upstairs window. I could see pretty far down the street, and in the distance, I could make out a car stalling on the side of the road. The headlights were still on, but it was surrounded by at least 6 people. 2 of them were dressed like the armed guards we'd seen earlier. It took me a while to realize there was an old man sitting in that car. I'd seen him around a couple of times, but I didn't know his name. The surrounding people were trying to crack the car windows with various weapons, tire irons, bricks, hammers, lead pipes. It didn't take them long to break through. They reached in to pull the man out. It was too far off for me to hear his screams, but I could vaguely see what they were doing. They held him down and covered his face with their hands. His eyes, his mouth, his ears, leaving only his nose to breathe through. And then, they just sat there. It took me a moment to realize what they were doing. They were forcing him to sleep. After a few minutes, they let go of him. The old man slowly stood up, leaned against his car, and started to dry heave. After a while, the same blue and black goo that I'd seen from Larry Peterson started pouring out of his mouth, stopping only as he coughed up some kind of clot that could barely fit in his mouth. A clot that moved. As he straightened his back, he looked at the strange group, and they walked down the street together. Some jogged, some sprinted, one of them crawled, but it looked like he held onto something with his teeth. Either that, or something was coming out of his mouth. Something long. As they hurried down the street, I could hear more gunfire. In the distance, coming from another way, I could see another group of people. At least a dozen, but heading in another direction. Roaming gangs of sleep-deprived sick people. God knows how this thing affected them long term. When my parents were done discussing, they sat me down to explain that we were going to stay indoors and keep away from the windows, just in case. We were locking all doors and windows, closing all curtains, and not playing anything louder than necessary. We were to draw as little attention as possible. Of course, I agreed. What choice did I have? That night, I could tell things were deteriorating. Dad almost took a double dose of booster shots as he forgot he'd taken the first one, but Mum stopped him. There were no phone calls coming in. They stopped checking in on us. Mom even tried calling, but the line had been disconnected. The gunfire outside was further away, but more frequent. We could hear cars honking, but no sirens. Then, there were the fires. At least two, somewhere downtown. We could see the smokestacks from afar. Mom wasn't doing well. She couldn't eat, and at times she could barely stay on her feet. She kept talking out loud, even if no one was in the room with her, and she had to lean against things to stay upright. She couldn't keep the fiber bars down, and she kept walking around with her head bobbing back and forth. Dad tried his best to keep her active, but he was having trouble as well. No matter how many cold splashes he took to the face, he just couldn't stay attentive. I wasn't doing well either, but nowhere near as bad. I still had my appetite, and I took my booster shots, but I could feel the side effects. My hands kept shaking, and I had a nasty headache. There were these pinches down my neck, like someone was shocking me with a wet battery. I'd imagine things moving just outside of my vision. I kept turning around to look at the windows as I started to hallucinate that they were screens. By morning, there was a new problem. Both the power and the water had been cut. There was a small lake a short walk from the house, and we had no choice but to try and get some water by hand. We had some drinking water stocked in the kitchen, but we needed some for the bathroom. Mom volunteered to go, but that was out of the question. She could barely stand or make a coherent sentence. There was no discussion. Dad had to do it. We watched him from one of the upstairs windows. The sun had just risen, bathing the withering landscape in long, sharp shadows and a sickly bright glow. Mom was just staring blankly ahead, as if trying to remember what was so important. "Isn't it your birthday soon?" she said out loud. "That was Tuesday," I responded. Did you wish for you to get older?" she asked. "I wished for that. I want you to be able to get older." She looked at me and laughed maniacally. She blinked one eye at a time, her left eye lingering a bit longer than her right. Her eyes were sunken and dark, and she kept going cross-eyed. I think she meant well, but that look she gave me was nothing short of terrifying. It was like she'd been reduced to her most basic self. My mom was still in there somewhere, but most of it was just gone. After about an hour, I spotted Dad coming back. Mom and I were both relieved, but it didn't last long. I noticed he wasn't carrying any water. Moments later, I could see he wasn't alone. There were about 24 more people coming with him. Mom didn't seem to react. She just looked out the window and nodded to herself. For a moment, she was almost falling asleep standing up, her mouth moving up and down on its own like a bass out of water. I could see something moving in her throat. I shook her, and in a moment of clarity, she looked out the window again. As I heard something pounding against the door downstairs, Mom pushed me into the closet. She ran downstairs to get the remaining booster shots and dropped it all on me, along with a wristwatch and a couple of fiber bars. "Someone will come get you," she said. Just wait and stay awake. I'll try to think of something." I didn't have time to protest before she slammed the closet shut. I could hear a key slide into the lock downstairs. Dad may have forgotten something about who he was, but he hadn't forgotten how to use the house keys. I just sat there in the dark, listening. I curled up into a ball, but I didn't want to get too comfortable. I could hear furniture being turned over, unfamiliar voices yelling obscenities or incoherent nonsense. A fight broke out, and I could hear someone throwing something. Another person ran up the stairs and into the bedroom, repeatedly kicking the bathtub. A woman screamed, then a man. There was a gunshot, followed by windows being broken. I could hear a muffled scream as someone was held down, maybe like they did with the old man outside the night before. I must have sat there for hours. In the dark, it was hard to tell if my eyes were open or not. I couldn't tell if I was really hearing something outside, or if I was just imagining it. I could hear voices and whispers, but they didn't seem to make sense. Sometimes I imagined them standing just outside my door, asking me for the cheat codes for the game I just played. All I had to keep my waning sanity company was my mom's wristwatch, and I could barely make it out. Time passed so strangely. I could be wrapped in a thought for what felt like hours, but only minutes passed. Then I'd catch myself staring straight ahead, and 2 hours could disappear. I kept repeating the next scheduled hour for the booster shot like a mantra. But things were getting stranger. The clock would go backwards. I'd imagine someone sitting across from me, a pair of white eyes staring back at me from the dark. There were little voices telling me to go to sleep, and I found myself nodding off. I could feel something moving in me, like a hand trying to fit into a glove. I finally gave up and got out of the closet. I could barely stand as I dragged the booster shots and fiber bars along in a plastic bag. I didn't care if there was anyone downstairs. I needed to see something. I needed light or some kind of stimuli. The whole house was trashed. Every piece of furniture broken, every light smashed. There was blood splatter on the walls, and the front door was hanging on a single hinge. Every window was smashed, and our picture frames had been thrown across the room like ninja stars. But the strangest thing was an acrid smell coming from the kitchen. At first, I didn't understand what it was. It looked like a person, but there was the wrong number of limbs. After a few seconds of adjustment and trying to force myself to clarity, I realized it was a dead body. A young man with a knife sticking out of his chest, splayed out on the kitchen floor. His jaw was extended and broken on one side. There was a black and blue arm reaching out of his throat, reaching upwards to grab his own head. Something in me stirred. Something in me didn't like what I was looking at, and I wasn't sure if it was me or something else. I tried to push it down with a fiber bar, which strangely worked. I made my way outside in a daze. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to find my parents. Another part of me wanted to get out of town. I wanted to look for a bike or just start walking or catch a bus. Of course, there were no buses to catch, but my sleep-deprived mind couldn't separate fact from fiction anymore. That entire night was one long living nightmare. I kept imagining things coming out of the dark. I could hear voices telling me to turn around, to stop, to run, all at once and none at all. I could barely keep my balance, and stopping even for a moment would send me straight to sleep. I had to keep moving. I even took an extra booster shot, which just gave me this sharp jolt of pain and made me sweat. I could tell I'd done something stupid. I took a shortcut through the park. I could see faces coming out of the trees. I saw a man lying down on the gravel path, being pulled forward by an arm coming out of his mouth. I saw a man out by the lake, repeatedly slapping his arms against the cold water surface, like a maniac child trying to get as high a splash as possible. Some of it was real. Some of it wasn't. I couldn't tell which was which. Not anymore. When I finally reached downtown, I saw at least 24 people gathered outside a burning building, all of them with black and blue arms reaching out of their mouths, stretching towards the flame, as if slowly wafting air towards them. Like human kelp moving against an invisible current, they leaned back and forth in unison, praising whatever chaos they caused without a word or sound. And yet, I could hear them, welcoming me, beckoning me, all voices unique, carried to me by an unfelt wind. "Come closer," it begged. "You belong here." I turned away, and the voices grew louder, desperate, screeching, demanding my attention, my devotion. Some of them coming from outside, some of them coming from the rumble of my stomach. "It's already here," it laughed. "It'll never go away. It'll never sleep. It'll never stop." Hands reached for me, a face in every window, voices reaching from beneath the concrete. Gunfire, broken windows, glass cracking under my rubber boots as I shuffled past burnt-out cars. It was dark, then bright, then dark again. And at some point, I succumbed. I felt concrete against my cheek, but I couldn't bring myself to get up. My legs wouldn't move, my eyes wouldn't open. "Yes," the voices laughed. Come to us. Come burn with us." And then, darkness. I don't know how long I was out. Hours, maybe half a day. I woke up to see a man running towards me, asking me if I was okay. A car had pulled over, bathing me in a warm light. By the side of the road, a colony of frogs looked at me. In the distance, my eyes landed on a discolored flower. It had turned blue. Strange how you don't notice the most obvious changes until they stare at you in the face. Turns out, exposure had happened at least 6 hours earlier than the man with the clipboard had predicted, and I'd been awake long enough for most of the effect to pass through my system. I was found unconscious by the side of the highway about 9 miles from my house. While I did have an uncomfortable dreamless sleep, the effects it had on me were nowhere near as bad as what had happened to most of the neighborhood. I'm sure you've all heard of it. Riots, they called it. Just another mess up in a low-income area. I don't even think it reached national news. Some of the people who succumbed to it early got permanent brain damage. Larry Peterson was never the same. But it was hard to tell if it was because of the emotional trauma or the sleep thing. Either way, he had to have a nurse come to look after him a few times a week for the rest of his life. Mom and Dad weren't completely unharmed either. Mom developed some kind of narcolepsy after that night, spontaneously nodding off at the most inopportune times. Dad lost his sense of taste and smell. To this day, they're having a hard time explaining what exactly they experienced. To them, it was just like going to sleep and having the most horrible nightmare, only to wake up in a hospital bed. Sometimes I wonder if I did fall asleep. Some of the things I saw were so strange that there was no way to tell if they were real or not. I vividly remember that scene of hands waving back and forth outside that burning building downtown. It had to be real. That building really did burn. As you might imagine, I have a hard time looking back at this. Thinking too much about it gives me this icy feeling in the pit of my stomach, like some part of me believes that this is all just a big nightmare, that I'm still just a clock's tick away from waking up in that closet, with someone standing just outside, waiting for me. Or maybe it's something inside of me, still waiting to grab the reins. Maybe it's just a night away. Click. I exhaled sharply as I lowered the revolver from my temple. Today marks the 5th anniversary of Nadia's disappearance. Hard to believe it's been that long. We had so much time left, so much life to live together. But that all came to a screeching halt half a decade ago on the day we found those stairs. Without her, I have no purpose. I've got no family, no friends, no one to keep me tethered to this world. So, every year on the night that Nadia went missing, I stumble out to the spot that it happened with my 6-shooter in hand, halfway drowned in a handle of vodka, and I let the forest decide if I'm going to live for another year, or if I'm going to be reunited with her, wherever she is. Now that it's determined that I have at least one more trip around the sun, I'll tell you how I ended up here at rock bottom. I need to get this out while I still have the guts to tell this story. Don't know why though. I'm going to wake up sometime tomorrow afternoon with a massive headache and no recollection of tonight's events. I'd better tell you while I still can. I've lived on the outskirts of Bear Creek National Park for my entire life. Don't bother looking it up. It's a fake name, so nobody tries to seek out the evil that lurks here. It's safer that way. As I was saying, I used to live out here in a cabin with my dad. I miss him so much. He passed away 8 years ago, leaving me all alone. Cancer sucks. That was before Nadia and I started dating. It's funny how things work out. I actually met her at a coffee shop on my way back from visiting Dad's grave. When she approached me and asked if the seat across from me was taken, I was instantly smitten. Her deep blue eyes shimmered like the ocean. Long brown hair cascaded down to her shoulders in waves. And that smile. When Nadia smiled, it was as if time stopped just for a moment so that the whole world would soak in its breathtaking beauty. We were inseparable after that day. In a month, we were dating. In 9 more, we were living together in my cabin. And in another year, we were set to get married. Had a date and a venue picked out and everything. I was on cloud 9. But that was all torn from me in an instant. God, I wish I never would have taken her out there. I had my first experience with the stairs when I was 7. Dad had always warned me never to climb them. That wasn't a problem for me though. The stairs exuded a malevolent presence. Like anyone who dared to walk up their steps would be eaten alive from fear alone. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was playing in the woods near the cabin when I saw it. A black, winding set of metal stairs that stretched maybe a story. They didn't lead anywhere. They just kind of ended. All the stairs are like that. They vary in size and shape and model. But the one thing they all have in common is that they don't lead anywhere. And they're never in the same place twice. They just sort of materialize. No one knows how or why. And truthfully, we don't want to know. Most of us, that is. Nadia wanted to know. And that knowledge cost her everything. "Come on, baby, just a little further. I want to see the sunset," Nadia whined in protest at my proposal to head back. "Nadia, I know you, but we didn't bring flashlights and our phone batteries aren't worth crap. I don't know about you, but I don't feel like smacking into trees every few feet on our way home." "Oh, fine, you win. I'll go back this time, but promise me we can come back tomorrow," she requested, puffing out her lower lip and gazing up at me with her best puppy dog eyes. I'd be lying if I said they hadn't worked. "All right, I'll take you back out here tomorrow, but only if you... I trailed off, entranced by the sight of them. Nadia's brow knitted together in confusion as she traced my gaze. Then her jaw fell open. Directly before us stood a polished cedarwood staircase. I got a sinking feeling in my gut the moment I laid eyes on that thing. It looked so out of place, like a rat in a fish tank. "What is that thing?" Nadia muttered, gaze still fixed to it. "It's nothing. I'll tell you later," I said, snatching her hand and leading her in the opposite direction. "Oh, Jason, let go. Why are you making such a big deal out of this? Tell me what's going on, or I'm not going to move another inch," Nadia protested, crossing her arms defiantly. I sighed. There was no point in hiding it any longer. She was going to find out eventually. "Okay, so this is going to sound completely unhinged, but please, bear with me. Ever since I've lived here, ever since anyone's lived here really, people have been finding random staircases in the forest. They appear and disappear all the time, and you'll never find one in the same place twice. The stairs are a bad omen. Something awful happens if you climb to the top, but no one quite knows what. All I know for certain is we need to stay far, far away from them." Nadia rolled her eyes in response. "Come on, Jay. Do you really expect me to believe that? A bad omen? Are you some kind of spiritual medium now? Ooh, a staircase, so scary," she said, waving her hands in a mocking gesture. "Nadia, do I look like I'm joking? I know it sounds crazy, but I wouldn't lie to you." She softly took my hands into hers and met my gaze. "Baby, you know I wouldn't accuse you of that. It's strange, but if it really irks you that much, I won't press it, okay? Thank you. Now, let's go home. I'm starving." Once we were out of sight of that wretched thing, I could sense the tension starting to disperse. It was as if a veil had been lifted. I fell asleep that night with a stomach full of dumplings and not a thought in the world besides the petite girl snuggled in my arms. The stairs had vanished from my brain, just like they always did. Until the next day. We both had the entire day off work, and before I knew it, Nadia was pulling me back down the same path as the day prior to watch the sunset. Butterflies danced in my stomach as we approached the spot that we'd seen the stairs the day before. Even so, Nadia noticed it first. "Hey, isn't this the same place you pulled me away from yesterday? Those stairs, they're gone. See, I told you they were a bad omen. Now do you believe me?" "I never said I didn't. It's just a strange phenomena, you know, like seeing a unicorn. You don't really expect to find it, or in this case, not find it. It's a lot to process." I didn't know what to say. She'd hit the nail on the head with her analysis, except the staircases were no unicorns. No, there was something far more sinister. We continued our walk in silence until we finally reached our destination. That evening will always stand out in my mind. The sky looked like a painter's canvas, a gorgeous amalgamation of purple and pink and orange melded together behind a smattering of light, wispy clouds. I'd never seen anything so picturesque. We stayed there well past the sunset, staring up into a sea of stars illuminating the night sky. "Thank you for keeping your promise. Today was perfect," Nadia yawned, sleepily resting her head on my shoulder. "Every day with you is perfect. Thank you for dragging me out of the house. This really has been incredible. I love you so much." "You're welcome, Bonehead. I love you too." Nadia giggled quietly, her eyes struggling to stay open. "Alright, sweetheart. I think it's time for us to go back. You can hardly stay awake." "Just a little longer. You're so comfy," she protested, burying her head into my chest. My heart felt so full in that moment. What had I done to deserve such an amazing girl? "Alright, up we go," I said, hoisting my weary girlfriend into my arms. "If your legs won't move, I have no choice but to carry you." "Oh no, how terrible. Whatever shall I do?" she quipped, wrapping her arms around my neck. "Nothing. Just stay still and let me..." I froze mid-stride. I swallowed a dry lump in my throat as sweat began to bead atop my brow. In the darkness among the foliage, my flashlight beam fell upon a large, bulky object. They were back. "Jason, what's wrong? You look pale," Nadia said, following the ray of light until she realized what I was looking at. A wide set of weathered concrete steps ascended to nowhere. They called to me, begging me to climb them. Just one step. Just one. That's all. "Jason, I feel it now. What you were talking about yesterday. I feel it. It's all wrong. They shouldn't be here," Nadia whimpered, fear jolting across her pupils. Yeah, you're right," I said, ripping my gaze from the awful thing. "Just don't look at it. We're going to be okay." This time, I wasn't as relieved once we'd escaped the staircase's alluring pull. I'd never seen the stairs 2 days straight before. They were always more sporadic in their appearance, never showing up with any rhythm or consistency. So to see them twice made me feel a bit uneasy. Nadia and I didn't mention the stairs again that evening. We were both absolutely exhausted, and we were itching to get some much needed rest. I'd be damned if I wasn't going to let some stupid staircase ruin a good night's sleep. Nadia was already snoring when I joined her in bed, and I was out the second my head hit the pillow. If only we could have made it until morning. Maybe then she'd still be here. I awoke in a pitch-black room. Nadia was missing from her side of the bed. I didn't worry at first. It wasn't abnormal for her to sneak off to the bathroom in the middle of the night every once in a while. I didn't want to drift back off until I had her beside me though. I waited and waited to no avail. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I finally called out, "Hey babe, are you coming back to bed soon?" I received no response. That was when the panic set in. Nadia would never ignore me like that. I leapt out of bed and beelined for the bathroom. It was empty. My heart began to pound against my ribcage like a jackhammer. Sirens were blaring in my head, telling me that something was wrong, and I felt helpless to silence them. I turned the whole cabin inside out with no results. Nadia was nowhere to be found. Then, amongst all the chaos, an idea flickered in my head. Why hadn't I thought of it sooner? Nadia's phone was missing from the bedside, but I could track a location and find my friends. I fumbled to unlock my own phone and open the app. I had to know that she was okay. I loaded up the app and located Nadia's icon. She was close. The app said that she was only a few hundred feet from the cabin. I threw on a pair of shorts and darted out into the frigid night air. I raced barefoot across the leaves and rocks and acorns. I didn't have time to grab shoes. Right then, I didn't care if my feet were torn to ribbons as long as Nadia was okay. I eventually reached the point where her phone should have been. I frantically called it, praying that she would pick up this time. I saw something illuminate amongst the leaves, and not far beyond it, I found who I was searching for. But instead of being overcome with joy upon finding the love of my life, my blood turned ice cold. Nadia's face was partially illuminated by the moonlight trickling through the canopy. She was gazing down at me with tears streaming down her cheeks. Below her feet sat a staircase. This time, it was ornate. White, glassy marble stairs gleamed, even in the darkness, topped off with a pristine red carpet. The stairs looked as if they would lead straight to heaven itself, and that terrified me. Dread crashed over me like a tidal wave as we stared at each other. I wanted to move. I wanted to sprint up to her and sweep her off those godforsaken things. But I couldn't. I was rooted in place, forced to watch as the girl of my dreams ascended the final step. "Jason, please, I don't want to go. I love you and I want to stay with you forever. I had to know. I could feel them calling to me. Please don't let them take me." Nadia sobbed uncontrollably, reaching out a hand toward me. I wanted to grab it, to pull her into my arms, to tell her that everything was going to be okay. But I was stuck. I was forced to watch in abject horror as Nadia involuntarily took that one last step to the top. It felt as if time had slowed to a crawl. 1 second I was paralyzed, eyes locked on Nadia and those vile stairs. And the next, I was alone. Nadia and the staircase had vanished into the cool night air like they'd never existed at all. The burden of that night will stay with me until the day I die. I wailed, I screamed, I pounded the earth until my fists were bloody and my throat was hoarse. Nadia had been taken from me right before my very eyes, and I did absolutely nothing. I blamed myself for a long time after that. Hell, I still do. I don't think I'll ever be able to move on. That's my punishment, I suppose. Living out a dull, meaningless life while images of my lost girlfriend run through my head day in and day out. It's why I drink. Strangely enough, I've never seen the stairs again. They're really the only reason that I'm still here. Because maybe, if I just give in, maybe if I convince myself to climb that one last looming step, then there might be a chance that I'll be reunited with Nadia. And for me, that's the chance that I have to take. It began with a black bag over my head. 6 or 7 men seizing me off the street on my way home from work, holding me at gunpoint in the back of a van. They explained in detail what would happen to my family if I didn't listen to them. Until that moment, torture was just a word. I'd never given it much thought. I wasn't prepared to hear some of the things they told me. By the time they were loading me onto a helicopter, I would have done anything they asked. I arrived at the black site, kicked out of the chopper, where my feet hit the hard-packed wet mud with a splash. Black hood torn off so hard it hurt the skin on the tip of my nose. And then, I got my first look at the place. Can't say if it met my expectations or not. I didn't have any idea where I was going or what it was supposed to look like when I got there. Still, it managed to leave me feeling surprised. An abandoned village nestled in the jungle. Mostly one-room hovels, lots of corrugated iron. Here and there lay burned allotments, dying pepper plants left untended, their fruits stamped into the earth by the passage of soldiers dressed in all black. Rotten fences and troughs to feed long-dead pigs and goats lay smashed to pieces. And then, lurking on a hill like some architectural jump scare, was a 3-story hospital made of glass and steel. State-of-the-art, built in a place where tarmac was just a rumour. Officially, it had been put there by a charitable non-profit wanting to research novel diseases and potential cures deep in the jungle. Unofficially, it had always belonged to the CIA, a useful place to test strange things with pox in the name. And when the time came, a useful place to dissect the impossible. Imagine my surprise when I was escorted by armed men to an office with my name on the door and discovered that I was to be in charge of its latest major project. Head of Research printed on the glass. Real official looking. Big black letters like I'd always worked there. First thing I thought, how long do they intend to keep me here? But that didn't last long. The hospital became my home and has been ever since. Less than 24 hours after my arrival, and I had my feet up on the desk barking orders at lab technicians. I slipped into the role easier than I'd like to admit. You see, where they got me was on scientific curiosity. That's how they ensured I was on board with the project. That's why they never pointed a gun at me after day one. They didn't have to. The second I saw that thing inside the Messiah's chest cavity, I was a willing asset. No more me, only the project, the discovery and the revelations. Lying on that slab, nestled in the flesh of an otherwise normal-looking man, was a white-hot piece of divinity, a pinprick in the fabric of reality. I don't know how else to describe it. It was like I'd spent my whole life seeing two-dimensional shadows, and then I suddenly got a glimpse of the three-dimensional shapes casting them. I haven't seen my children since they took me. Couldn't tell you their names. I was never the same after the first autopsy. No one in that place was sane after the scalpel first bit into his flesh. Attrition amongst the research staff was incredibly high. Every day, another nurse seized by stigmata, or a once faithless lab technician struck by the call to write the third testament. The guards dealt with the unwilling members of the team. Traumatized scientists and clinicians lined up one by one against an exposed brick wall in the jungle heat and shot. I remember smoking in the cafeteria in between surgeries, nervously shaking as I tried to ignore the pop, pop, pop of some of my more stubborn colleagues being executed. And then back to work, where I suppressed the feeling that I was the worst kind of traitor. Next day, there'd be new faces scrubbing up and asking for orders, another pair of hands shipped in from God knows where. Back to cataloguing divinity. At times, I imagined joining the objectors, the people who found religion in a sterile Black Ops lab. But that thing we pulled out of him, that baffling enigma that burned my eyes, it consumed the project. Everything we learned about it felt like a quantum leap in our understanding of microbiology. We tested everything we could get our hands on. Plants, animals, humans. I tried not to look any of them in the eye. Quiet people taken from some quiet part of the earth where they wouldn't be missed. All of them scared. Did they know? I mean, really know the suffering they were in for? Definitely not. They expected to be shot, I imagine, not to wake up with the roof of their mouth lined with eyeballs. I'm ashamed to say, but those kinds of results invigorated me, excited me even. When it all fell apart and I missed the evacuation, I got to finally rifle through all those classified documents where I discovered I hadn't been selected because I was some genius of microbiology, but rather because my psychological profile made it clear I'd do anything if you dangled a big enough mystery in front of me. That, and the fact that I was actually quite good at managing projects. Geniuses usually aren't great at sending out memos or keeping track of performance numbers. Thankfully, I'm no genius. It was humbling at times, working with some of the guys down below, being senior to them even. I mean, Dr. Coates was probably the smartest man I'd ever met. No real academic career, because he had a habit of hyperfixating on things that either couldn't be solved or which no one gave a damn about. But it was pretty clear this was a guy who could have turned his brain to just about anything and made a name for himself if he was just a little more on the ball. He was an oddun, basically. Gave lectures barefoot, would respond to last-minute marking deadlines by giving every student a B, threw a stapler at the head of his department, that kind of thing. Intelligent, but not particularly sensible. The project broke him, broke his worldview, broke his mind and, towards the end, even his body. You might think the problem was asking a hyper-rational man to process the divine, but if anything, he processed it a little too well. He was the first person to read the Third Testament without going insane. Immediately insane, I should say. Or maybe he was always nuts to begin with. Either way, he managed to take all the random scribbles and bits of verse that we'd collected from the personal effects of the deceased and actually put it together into a single document. Then he read it and came out looking like nothing special had happened. The next guy after him, not so lucky. But Dr. Coates, he carried on working for a few days after, took measurements of this, made records of that, slipped into the background, out of my notice, while I focused on trying to figure out some way of getting the Third Testament scanned into a computer without it causing havoc. A lot like the people who read it, machines like to give out halfway through reading the Third Testament. Not Coates, though. He seemed just fine. I should have known better. The first clue that something wasn't quite right was when I went to his office. A cramped space with metal walls and floors, no windows given it was below ground, and a countertop full of equipment. It was always a mess in there, and usually a bit smelly too. But it was usually just that unwashed scientist smell. But one day, when I went to call on him, he opened the door and I got the whiff of something that was just wrong. Smelled a little like death, only not quite. Just different. Moldy almost. Of course, he was entitled to do some experimentations on his own time, and that's what I figured it was. At the time, I wrote it off. Had other things on my mind. Only the smell got worse with time. Turned up day after day, and each time it stung my nose a little more, hung around my sinuses a little longer. And Coates, he looked a little worse for wear each time too. Again, nothing serious. The kind of thing that's actually quite normal for a man like him. I'm used to seeing scientists fixate on a problem, something quiet they won't share with anyone else until they know for sure what they've got. That's what he was like, and I figured when he was ready, he'd either show me something that would blow my socks off, or it'd be something stupid, like he got his microwave to evenly heat up his lunch by taking it apart and rewiring its insides. Sometimes I wonder if I'd caught it earlier. Could I have done something about it? Someone smarter might have picked up the odd chemical mixtures on his shelf, or recognized the peculiar smells. Not me, though. All I can say in hindsight is thank God my office was above ground. By the time his little project had finished working its way through the floor he was on, he'd killed 36 people with his homemade nerve gas. Thankfully, the facility was prepared for that kind of attack, and the automated security systems had the entire level locked down very quickly so the damage wasn't that bad. Could have been a lot worse. But what was weird was the venting system wasn't working. Should have cleared it out in under a day. But 4 hours later, and the gas levels were the same. The investigation, at least at first, had to happen remotely. CCTV from his lab was spotty. Something was corroding the cameras. But based on some of his material requests, we guessed he'd been culturing some unusual fungus to create the bioweapon. Whatever it was potent, and we were helpless to do anything about it. We had to wait and hope to God whatever awful thing he'd concocted would wear out on its own. What little the CCTV could capture made for a grueling sight. 8 scientists dead at their desks, slumped over, blood pouring out of their mouths. The fluid looked black on the grainy black and white monitor. But what upset me more were the assistants. Dozens of young men and women who didn't really belong in that place. Too much to live for, and all of them so scared of what was going to happen to them. And they were just lying there, in the middle of whatever it was they were doing. In the labs themselves, smashed beakers and machines in disarray. In their rooms, some of them lay peacefully sleeping. Others held each other in secret little trysts they thought no one knew about. All over the level, bodies lay on the floor in strange positions. And again, that black fluid leaking from every orifice, staining the floor, their faces and their clothes, soaking their chests and groins. I remember sitting there and just watching them twitch and foam at the mouths, waiting for death to finally come. Even then, the hours ticked on as we waited for the systems to purge the gas. 12, 24, 48. Nothing happened. It was like everything in there was frozen in time. And then, somehow, the lights in that level went out. Emergency lighting came on, bathing everything in red. But combined with the low-quality cameras, it was like gazing at an old video game. Grainy, fuzzy, low resolution. We figured that Coates must have rigged up a remote timer on the electronics, which wasn't a good guess, since his speciality was biochemistry and the security systems were of the highest tier. But what else could it be? Wasn't like someone could have hit the circuit breaker. We knew eventually we'd have to go in there. 60 hours after shutdown, we just had to. There was too much high-value material to leave behind, and there were reports of strange noises down there. Guards posted to the door heard faint sounds on the other side. Footsteps, they reckoned. Of course, I wrote that off. Utter nonsense, I told myself and them. And yet, we still went in armed because, well, if Coates was smart enough to rig this whole nightmare, who's to say he didn't make a little gas mask to keep himself safe? You'd think I'd be used to working in hazmat suits, and I sort of am. But going into that sealed-off floor was something else. The visor felt restrictive. The squeak of the rubber suit was deafening. My breath was too loud. And every time the in-suit radio came to life with one of the soldiers' barks, I damn near jumped out of my skin. And then the door actually opened. Nothing could have prepared me for that. The air was thick with mist, which lit up harshly with the emergency lighting's red hue. Old metal grates, vents, open doorways, all of it either blood red or completely dark. There were far too many shadows for it to feel safe. It didn't help some of the bulbs were strobe lighting, rotating sirens that lit the place up in periodic flashes of crimson light. God, even the 4 soldiers next to me looked nervous. We passed more than a few bodies on our way to Coates' lab. All of them lay where they'd been on the CCTV, at least as far as I could tell. Sounds stupid, but I stared at a few of them closely just to make sure. All those reports of footsteps had started to worm their way into my brain. Couldn't shake the idea we weren't alone down there. When we finally opened the door to Coates, what I saw left me frozen to the spot. The soldiers focused on the strange growth off to the corner of the room, which registered to me only as a dim sort of collection of thick fungal petals crawling up the wall, veins pulsing like capillaries in the eye. But to me, what really hit home was the empty desk. Last time they had reliable footage of that room, Coates had been lying there, dead as a dodo, blood leaking from his still open eyes, pooling on the desk and dripping onto the floor. And that stain was still very much there. There was even the faint outline of where his head had been laying. But the man himself was gone. This, even more than the grotesque thing that took up one wall, terrified me. That quivering mass of fungus was pumping out enough toxic gas to kill half the base, but it was stationary at least. In another circumstance, I might have even found it fascinating. But Coates, he'd clearly gone off the deep end. Had he lain perfectly still for days on end to trick us? That didn't seem right. Again, I thought the bodies we'd passed, the way they looked so still, but not lifeless, like a porcelain doll, there was that slight suggestion of something working behind the eyes. "What do we do with this?" one of the men asked. "Take samples, burn the rest," I replied. "If gas levels don't go down in a week, we'll have to purge the whole floor with phosphorus." The whole time, I had my eyes on the space around us, under the desk, on top of the cupboards. If Coates wasn't at his desk, where was he? "Where the hell did this thing come from?" the same soldier muttered as he laid a series of thermal charges on the fleshiest parts of the mold. It seemed to flinch in response to his touch, but otherwise benign. He probably took some of the subject's tissue samples. We know it propagates unusual levels of growth in plants and animal tissue. Explains why the gas levels don't go down. What's it metabolizing? I gave the soldier an odd look. "What?" he said. "You aren't the only ones with an education." "Fair enough," I replied, with a quick shake of the head. "It isn't metabolizing anything except his tissue. It's, well, bluntly, I think of the fish and the bread, right? It's something we've known about his tissue samples for a while now. Spontaneous creation of matter and energy out of nothing. But, to give Coates credit, this is a pretty novel application. He's created an infinite bioweapon." "Why?" I was about to reply, I haven't the slightest clue, when a loud bang drew our attention to the doorway. Outside lay a darkness, broken only by the strobing of a red light. Flashing on and off, it revealed, for just a single instant, the outline of a man standing in the hallway. The soldiers swore nervously as they raised the rifles. By the time the light came back, the figure was gone. "Who the hell was that?" one barked. "Must be Coates," another replied. "Job's done," I cried while gesturing to the charges. "Let's get the hell out of..." "There are no miracles left for you. You have made your own miracles." The words were growled so loud and deep they seemed to vibrate my very bones. The soldiers snapped to attention. But me? I took a little longer to turn back to the corner of the room. I knew what I was going to see. But God, I didn't want to see it. There are other gardens, but not for you. Do not spoil the other Edens. Coates emerged from the thing in the wall, pulling himself free with a wet squelch. He stood, not naked, but clearly naked, as his skin began to absorb his clothes. He looked like a burn victim coated in algae. He loves you. In spite of everything, he loves you. And there is a place in heaven for you all. But it is time to... I can't blame the soldier who pulled the trigger. It wasn't just the fact that Coates was speaking with a mouth that had grown grotesquely across his abdomen, but rather that the words were drilling straight into our heads, like some pushing up. It made my eyes cross, my ears ache, and my nose bleed. Two of the men had vomited, splattering the inside of their visors with thick fluid. They were the first to go. They didn't see what hit them, and I'm somewhat glad. Coates, angered by the gunshot, moved with the elegance of a dancer. I stumbled out into the corridor as he tore them apart, his arms seemingly flowing right through their biohazard suit. The remaining soldier, the trigger-happy one, was beside me as I fled. It wasn't far to the exit. I hoped we would make it the rest of the way without incident, that in just a few short hours I might be able to put the few images I had of Coates pulling flesh and fabric apart like it was tissue deep into some recess of my mind and just move on. But it was only a few short steps into the dark before the remaining soldier began to fire blindly at the corridor behind us. It was a mistake for him to turn around. In the fraction of a second where his eyes had been turned away, he missed one of the bodies lying on the ground. I jumped. He didn't. I was dimly aware of there being no one beside me only when the gunshots grew fainter and fainter as I left him behind. One of the shots dinged off a panel by my head, and to this day, I suspect it was not a ricochet, but a deliberate attempt to get revenge for me abandoning him. Still, I didn't look back. Not until I reached the secure door. I thumbed the keypad frantically, terrified as my ears registered the sound of approaching footsteps muffled by the biohazard suit. God, I couldn't stop myself. I looked. I had nothing else to do except wait for the security to clear me and open the door, and there was no guarantee they'd even do that. I might be waiting forever, staring at nothing as Coates came closer and closer. Without even realizing what I was doing, I turned and saw the soldier with a gun. Jeez, Coates' office was out of sight, so I had no idea if he repeated this with the other two. But the man I saw, he was in pieces, yellow and red in ragged strips that coated the ceiling as much as the floor, and barreling toward me on all fours, legs and arms too long for a normal man, came Coates, eyes wide, jaw distended, chunks out of his head still missing. But his mouth, it silently spoke the same few words, almost in time with his loping gallop, over and over and over. It would take days for me to even realize what it was he was saying. Thankfully, before he'd managed to reach me, the doors opened and a hail of gunfire filled the corridor ahead. Coates, fast as lightning, disappeared into some dark crevice, and I was dragged to safety before the worst might happen. As soon as I was on the other side, I told security to flood the place with phosphorus, and everything was purged. White-hot fire on demand. By the time it was over, only metal remained, and even then, a lot of it had melted and cooled in strange shapes on the floor. I also went out of my way to kill any attempts at reclaiming the lost workplace. Higher-ups were mad. All that square footage lost, but I said the risk of contamination was too great. Of course, I left out the part where I returned one quiet night a few days later and placed my ear against the thick steel wall that I knew ran close to one of the vents on that level. It was faint, but I heard Coates whispering. Only then did I get the final clue to what Coates had been saying as he came towards me in the flashing red of that darkened corridor. We love you, we love you, we love you, we love you, we love you. Even now, the cameras show that level to be a sterile, hollow space, but I cannot escape the feeling that if I were to open it, I would see Coates come slithering out of some long-forgotten vent, perhaps worse for wear, given all the time that has since passed, but Coates nonetheless. Terrifying and misshapen, but desperate to spread the very testament that twisted his mind and body, that caused him to try and breed something that might well have ended the entire world. And the worst thing of all, what he'd been saying to me in that corridor. What if it was true? What if he hadn't done it out of hate, but love? At the time, I assumed the force we were dealing with was hostile. But what if it wasn't? Everyone who goes near the Third Testament kills themselves, and until Coates, I thought it some kind of twisted revenge. But what if that wasn't the case? What if he wasn't doing it out of spite or hostility? What would that mean for me? Forgiveness? If so, that terrified me, because after everything I'd been through, I doubted I'd have the strength to resist that kind of offer. For weeks I lay awake at night, wondering just what the hell might be in those words that could compel people like Coates to do what they did. And yet, despite everything, I still haven't read the Third Testament. Coates was a genius, and he still gave in. I know that I did some pretty messed up stuff in the name of scientific curiosity, but, well, I guess I'm not ashamed to say I'm also a coward. I'm afraid of dying. Curiosity can only get you so far, and after seeing everything that happened to the people who read that thing, I couldn't bring myself to risk it. Whatever the Third Testament is, hearing it seems pretty bad for your health. I don't think I even deserve to be forgiven, if that is what he's offering. It was poetic justice that out of all the people who managed to make the evacuation, I wasn't one of them. Leaving on foot is hardly an option for me. I mean, even if I had the strength to hike through hundreds of miles of rainforest, I need to reach the outer fence first, and strange things have festered in the chemical pits where they disposed of the bodies. Soft mounds of ash and bone that sing from time to time, exciting the birds in the canopy to take off and make strange patterns in the sky. If they can sing, they must have mouths, right? And if they have mouths, what else? I think about Coates, about what kind of hands would reach out to drag me into those rotten pits of long dead flesh and drown me in filth. And I shudder. I could try and sneak past, but it really isn't safe outside the hospital. It isn't safe inside, to be fair. But what choice do I have? At least there's still power, internet, food to last me over a century, and security doors that keep everything below sub-level 1 firmly locked away. While out there, well, I see things sometimes, moving quickly between the old buildings. The trees shake and stir, and where jungle now grows thick and heavy against one of the glass walls of the hospital, the vines twist and turn and spell out odd messages. I shut my eyes firmly whenever I have to pass them. And yet, even blind, I can hear the tightening fibrous coils as the clawing flora scratches against the glass. They want me, hungering. All those corpses we buried out there, rotting, breaking down, contaminated with divinity. What strange waters flow through the soil in this place. Nothing could make me risk opening the doors and try walking through that vegetation. He might forgive, but I don't think my former test subjects have. And as for down below, you know, I never met him while he was alive. Don't know where they got him from, or even why. My bet. He ticked off the wrong people, got shot, and got back up. Maybe they shot him again and he got up again. Maybe they did it 5 times, 10 times. I don't know. Somewhere along the lines, someone worked out they had an anomaly on their hands. Maybe I wasn't the first person to even try cutting him open. It's just weird. No one ever told us who he was. We just knew. It'd be years before I wondered who mothered him, loved him, raised him. I often wonder if this was the way it was meant to go, or was it just an accident that he bumped into the wrong people at the wrong time? The Messiah came, and the first thing we did was cut him up. No wonder we failed. Things in the project started to go really bad about 6 months after the first incision. High turnover amongst researchers was one thing, but, well, it turns out a lot of the soldiers had religious inclination. It wasn't just us dealing with visions and voices. At some point, they worked out what they were part of. The agency likes compartmentalization, but it can only go so far. After the religious element became clear to the guys on the ground, things started to break down. It was one thing to control the scientists, but the guards were armed. When they broke hard. Most of his remains are stored in the lowest level, where it's easiest to keep things cool. Outside, there's this long corridor leading to the central chamber. Huge, wide enough to drive 4 or 5 cars side by side. And that was where the first guard hanged himself. Simple enough. They dragged him away and cleaned it up. It wasn't long after Coates. In fact, it was one of the men who saved me at the door. But pretty soon, another 2 guys went down there and hanged themselves, and then 5, and then 8. And then, topside, some people started blowing their brains out. In their barracks, in the canteens, standing watch at the doors, looking out on the jungle, cigarette hanging loose on one lip. Seemed almost random. Except there was a clear pattern of escalation. When those guys started killing their friends, that's when it reached the point where they couldn't ship new guys in fast enough to replace losses. Once that happened, orders started getting lost, jobs started being left undone. One lab got written off because a test subject's body was left to fester over a weekend, and by the time they got the door open, there was flesh growing up the walls. Not enough manpower to deal with it, so they left it for another day and moved on. Only, they forgot to tell the researcher who worked there. So, come Monday, he went in and had a hell of a surprise. Must have been like stepping into a wall of sourdough. I can only hope he suffocated and it was quick. But who knows? Not like that stuff has hard and fast rules. For all I know, he's still in there, screaming for air. Meanwhile, that tunnel. People just kept going down there and hanging themselves. I mean, every day I'd wake up and I'd be down a few researchers and a couple more guards would be missing. Took a shockingly short amount of time for most of the 600 people on site to just disappear. God knows when security stopped taking the bodies down. Just another job that got lost in the growing panic. By the time evacuation orders came, we were down to 100 people. I estimate that around 400 ended themselves in that tunnel. I've only visited him once since the project shut down. Only had the guts to go look once. Barely made it out alive. I felt compelled to try and face up to him, acknowledge the role I played. Only that meant actually getting to the door at the end of the tunnel, which was, by this point, pitch black except for my torch, and blocked almost entirely with hanging bodies. So many, pressed together so close that I had no hope of making my way through without bumping into one. Reminded me of the jungle, funnily enough, of a thick, claustrophobic forest made of dried skin and brittle ligaments, different colours and shapes, and of course, different levels of decomp. Some had lost their noses, lips and eyes. Others were a little bloated, but still recognizable. Not friends, really. I don't think I actually made one solitary friend on that project, but colleagues, people who were under my charge. They looked sad. All of them looked sad. They should have been buried at home with their families, but instead, they were locked all the way in the ass end of nowhere. Of course, you can bet your ass the agency will make sure no one ever knows the truth. You know, I still have contact with them. Anything I post gets screened. Arrogant assholes know that no one's gonna take me seriously. No record of this project anywhere. All those people, just ghosts in a system too big for any one person to keep track of it all. You know how many people go missing in the United States in a year? What about Europe? Or the whole damn world? God, this project was just a drop in the ocean. I wanted to put it to bed, to see if I could get some kind of answer from him. It was that idea, trying to get some resolution to this nightmare, that gave me the strength to push past the first dead body and go deeper into that tunnel. It reminded me of trying to make your way to the front of a gig, only deathly silent, and the people you barged past swung gently back and forth. The sound of makeshift nooses tightening in the dark. I think the worst part was the limited vision. My light was just a lone disc, and God, it was pitch black in that place, like caving, only the floor is slick, and you don't have to worry about a ravine. Made me think about being in the bottom of the ocean. With all the corpses, visibility was never more than a few foot ahead. I remember panicking at the realization I could easily get turned around and, well, if all those lost souls didn't let me go. What if I wound up going in circles for hours, days even, on end? Just round and round. The nearest wall could be right there, and I wouldn't know it. Just bones and teeth and ribs and hanging entrails. All of them cold to the touch, freezing. Obviously, that's why we'd put him down there. The place was cold, my own breath visible in the air, but the bodies were like the meat you grab out of the fridge in a supermarket. It was just awful. I found the fresh ones the hardest to stomach. A really rotten body looks almost like a prop. It isn't, don't get me wrong. You look at it and your brain tells you damn well it ain't a prop. But it's a hell of a lot easier to convince yourself it's just a thing when it hasn't got eyes or skin. But the fresh ones, sometimes they still had expressions like anger or sadness on their faces. They made me feel watched, and the fact they were cold and slick with condensation. Every time I bumped into one, it took everything I had not to let out a whimper. And they moved. They didn't move, not like that. But there were no drafts down there. It was perfectly still. They'd been perfectly still for months after the project shut down. And then I came along and disturbed them, and it was like a giant Newton's cradle, a static system that I put energy into. It began to sway and twist and bump. I'd knock one, and a fraction of a second later it would knock me back, jostling against my cheek or my arm as inertia rocked it back and forth. 10 minutes in, too far to turn back. That was when the nightmare began. Started small, I lost my ability to track what body was where and which ones were sent swinging by my own clumsy movements. And then fingers combed my hair. I cried out. Another set touched my beard, my face. I forced myself onwards and started making eye contact with one too many dead men for it to simply be an accident. Their expressions changed from sullen and listless to angry and cruel, leering smiles and curled lips. Then came the unmistakable sensation of someone deliberately grabbing for my arm. I had to shake it loose, too afraid to look back and face the possibility that I'd see one of them moving and scowling. I pushed on, constantly having to shake cold fingers off my elbow or my collar. They groped incessantly, looking for anything to hold on to. Firm grips pinched my belly fat, my shoulders, my chest, and then they started reaching for my eyes. At one point, I made the mistake of crying out, and a freezing cold finger with a slightly furry texture slid into my mouth. The only relief came when I dropped to my hands and knees and crawled. The entire time, my mind raced with a terrible possibility that I really was just being sent in circles, over and over and over. And they were never going to let me leave. I would die down there, in the dark, smothered by their rotting hands. Goddamn, I came close to giving up. When my torch finally alighted upon an open space, I cried out, a heaving wet sob made of relief and joy, and my muscles, given new life, worked overtime to get me out of that horrible nightmare and into freedom. I didn't stop until I bumped my head against the steel wall with a dull clang and looked up to see the vault's door. At last, the place we'd frozen him. I got up with what little dignity I had left, brushed down my clothes, and risked only the briefest of glances back. The bodies looked inert now, just like they had before I entered. I could have tricked myself into thinking it was my imagination. Only half my shirt was now in tatters on the floor, and I could still see strips of it still clenched in a few of their hands. I did my best to compose myself, and I entered the vault. We hadn't left him in a very nice state. The plan was to catalogue everything. Yeah, we excised the most striking biological anomalies, but the remaining flesh? We wanted to know everything. Every last capillary, every last cell. We wanted it recorded. So we had this special machine flown in. It works by taking a piece of flesh and slicing into a layer that's barely a micrometer thick and depositing it into a slide. That slide is digested and then stored in specialized cold refrigeration units. It's usually used on a sample not much bigger than a potato. But for him, we had something specially made. Frozen, stood vertical, we put him on the machine where it worked, creating about one slice every 3 hours. Only at the end, well, first, no one came to take the slides away, so they had gathered on the floor below in a terrible mess. And second, no one had bothered to check if he was still dead. Stupid of us, really. Of course he came back to life, only this time, he didn't get to leave the cave. I often wonder if he had anything left to say, but by then, the machine had reached his nose. Just his eyes at the top of his head looking right at me. Following me. God, we made a mess of things, didn't we? Made the Romans look gentle in comparison. I fell to my knees and begged for forgiveness. And the worst part? he gave it. Obviously not verbally, but it shouldn't surprise you to know he had other ways of putting thoughts in my head. I was so angry at myself. I was positive I'd find some kind of punishment waiting for me. But I didn't. He forgave me, told me I was loved. After everything I'd done, I mean, God, that hurt the most. I didn't deserve it. Still don't. And then he gave me the Third Testament, or rather, the Cliff Notes. Not enough to drive me nuts, but the gist of it, so to speak, did a number on me anyway. By the time I was done sobbing on the floor, I looked up, and he was gone. Nothing remained, just broken glass and a machine cutting empty air. Going back through the tunnel was no easier than going in, but I hardly remember it. I lost a couple of weeks after that little trip down below, but eventually I came to in my office. Now I stay above ground. I've asked for rescue, but the agency feels I best serve my country by staying where I am, making sure nothing else leaks out. It's messed up, but I think for once, they might be right. I've considered sharing what he gave me, considered even putting it in bits of writing here. Might even go get the full testament and upload it. But that would involve reading it. And like I said, I'm a coward, and I don't want to die. Everyone who reads it dies by their own hand. I guess all I can say is, the Third Testament, it's something of a warning, an outline of what's coming our way. So bad that he came just to offer us a way out, a promise that there's somewhere else, and an acknowledgement that we're going to need it. Makes me think of Coates, smartest man I ever met, whose first reaction to knowing what was on the way was to try and engineer something to wipe humanity all out. Given to what we did to him, I wonder if we don't deserve it.